Hello everyone. Tonight, I've prepared a special compilation of trucker stories, all gathered into one soothing episode for you to enjoy. Take a moment to like the video and subscribe. It really helps support the channel. Now, let's begin. Story 1. The delivery that took a week I can't remember. From Mudflap Marty. There are stretches of highway in this country that seem to exist outside of time. Roads that wind through landscapes so unchanging that you could drive for hours and swear you haven't moved an inch. I've been hauling freight for 23 years now, and I thought I'd seen every trick the road could play on a tired mind. Every illusion that exhaustion and isolation could conjure up in the cab of a semi. But there was one delivery, one single run from Memphis to a small town in eastern Oregon that I still can't entirely explain. And when I try to piece together what happened during those days, I find nothing but fog and fragments, like trying to remember a dream that slips away the moment you wake. It started ordinary enough, the way these things always do. I picked up the load on a Tuesday afternoon, 40,000 pounds of agricultural equipment destined for a farming cooperative I'd never heard of in a town called Millbrook, population 800 and declining. The dispatcher gave me the address, the delivery window was generous, and the pay was decent for a long haul. I remember pulling out of the depot with the sun beginning its slow descent toward the western horizon. That golden hour light that makes everything look like it's been dipped in honey. The radio played classic rock, my thermos was full of hot coffee, and the truck handled the weight like she was born for it. I remember crossing into Arkansas as darkness fell, the highway stretching out before me like a black ribbon stitched into the earth. I remember stopping at a truck stop somewhere near Little Rock, filling up on diesel and grabbing a sandwich that tasted like cardboard and regret. I remember the waitress who poured my coffee had a tattoo of a hummingbird on her wrist, and she smiled at me with tired eyes that said she understood the loneliness of the long haul. These are the details that stand out. Small moments of clarity in what would become a week-long blur, somewhere in Oklahoma. The road began to change, though I couldn't tell you exactly when or how. The highway seemed to narrow, or maybe it just felt that way, as if the darkness on either side was pressing in, making the illuminated stretch of asphalt ahead of me smaller and smaller. The radio started to crackle with static, losing stations faster than I could find new ones, until eventually all I could pick up was a low hum that sounded almost like breathing. I switched it off and drove in silence, listening to the rhythmic thrum of tires on pavement and the diesel engine's steady growl. Time became slippery after that. I would check my watch and see that it was 2 in the morning, then blink and find that it was 2 in the morning again, as if the night had looped back on itself. I told myself I was just tired, that I needed to pull over and rest. But every time I looked for an exit or a rest stop, the highway stretched on unbroken, mile after mile of empty road with no services, no towns. Nothing but darkness and the occasional flash of reflective signs that seemed to appear and disappear too. Quickly to read, I kept driving because I didn't know what else to do. The GPS on my phone had stopped working somewhere in the Texas Panhandle, the screen frozen on a map that showed me as a blue dot in the middle of nowhere, not moving despite the fact that the scenery outside my windows was constantly changing. I tried calling the dispatcher, but my phone had no signal, not even a single bar, just an empty network indicator that mocked me from the corner of the screen. Days passed, or what felt like days, though I can't be certain. I remember stopping for fuel at stations that seemed to materialize out of the darkness, empty places with flickering fluorescent lights and no attendants. Just paid-to-pump terminals that accepted my credit card without question. I remember eating from gas station shelves, grabbing whatever I could find, and leaving money on the counter because there was never anyone to ring me up. The food tasted like nothing, and I was never hungry. But I ate anyway, because it seemed like the thing to do, a habit from a life that felt increasingly distant. The landscape outside my windows changed and changed and changed. I drove through mountains I didn't remember crossing, through forests so dense that the trees formed walls on either side of the road, through deserts where the sand seemed to glow with an inner light, even in the dead of night. I saw signs for towns that didn't exist on any map. Names like Nowhere Junction and Last Chance and Hope's End. I passed other trucks sometimes, their running lights appearing in my mirrors and then vanishing before they could overtake me. Ghost vehicles crewed by phantom drivers heading to destinations I would never know. Sleep came in fragments, pulled over on the shoulder of roads that seemed to exist between places. Engine idling to keep the cab warm while I dozed in the driver's seat. My dreams during those moments were vivid and strange, filled with images of roads that spiraled upward into impossible of cargo bays that opened onto starfields instead of loading docks, of dispatch orders written in languages I couldn't read but somehow understood. I would wake with a start, heart pounding, and find that only minutes had passed, or hours, or no time at all. Then, as suddenly as the strangeness had begun, it ended. I came around a bend in the road and found myself on a normal highway, a state route I recognized from the atlas, with regular traffic and road signs that made sense. The GPS on my phone flickered back to life, showing me exactly where I was and how far I had to go. The radio picked up stations again, filling the cab with morning talk shows and weather reports. It was as if I had driven through some pocket of unreality and emerged back into the world. I knew. I delivered the load to Millbrook 3 days late, pulling up to the farming cooperative's warehouse with apologies ready on my lips and a story about mechanical troubles that I was prepared to tell. But the man who met me at the loading dock, a weathered farmer with kind eyes and calloused hands, just smiled and waved away my concerns. The delivery window had been flexible, he said, and I was right on time, according to their records. When I checked my phone, confused, I found that it was exactly the day and time that the original delivery had been scheduled for, as if those lost days on the road had never happened at all. I tried to piece together what had occurred, checking my logbook and my receipts and my phone records, but there were gaps, blank spaces where days should have been, and the few memories I had seemed to contradict each other. Impossible to arrange into any coherent timeline. The dispatcher had no record of me being late or out of contact. My credit card showed charges from the correct dates in the correct sequence, and my truck's odometer showed exactly the mileage it should have for a direct route from Memphis to Oregon. To this day, I don't know what happened during that delivery. Maybe it was exhaustion, a long hallucination brought on by too many hours behind the wheel and not enough sleep. Maybe it was something else, something stranger, a detour through roads that exist alongside our own but rarely intersect with them. All I know is that there's a week of my life that I can't account for. 7 days that compressed somehow into the space of none. And sometimes late at night when I'm driving through empty country, I find myself looking for the signs of that other highway, wondering if I'll ever find my way back to those lost roads again. Story 2. The freight yard full of frozen people. From Freightliner Frank. The freight yard sat on the outskirts of a town whose name I've since forgotten. One of those small industrial communities that exist solely to serve the rail lines and highways that pass through them. Places where the most permanent residents are the grain silos and warehouse. Buildings that tower over the modest homes and shuttered storefronts. I'd been directed there by dispatch to pick up a load of refrigerated goods. Nothing unusual. Just another job in a long career of hauling things from one place to another. It was late autumn, that time of year when the air turns sharp and the sun sets early, painting the sky in shades of amber and rust as the world prepares for winter's approach. I pulled into the yard around dusk, the rig's headlights cutting through the gathering darkness as I navigated the maze of containers and parked trailers that filled the sprawling lot. The place was bigger than I'd expected. Acre after acre of stacked freight and idle equipment, all of it eerily quiet in the fading light. There should have been forklifts moving, workers shouting instructions. the general organized chaos that accompanies any busy loading facility. Instead, there was only silence, broken occasionally by the distant clang of metal on metal, sounds that echoed through the yard and seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I parked near the main office building, a squat structure of corrugated metal and grimy. Windows that looked like it had been built in the 70s and forgotten about shortly thereafter. The lights were on inside, a yellowish glow that spilled out onto the cracked pavement. But when I climbed down from the cab and approached the door, I found it locked. I knocked, waited, knocked again. No response. Through the window, I could see a desk with papers scattered across its surface, a coffee mug still steaming, a jacket draped over the back of a chair. It looked like someone had just stepped away, though there was no sign of anyone nearby. I checked my phone, thinking I'd call the number dispatch had given me, but I had no signal. Not unusual out here in the industrial Badlands, where cell towers were few and far between, so I decided to walk the yard, figuring I'd find someone eventually, a night watchman or a late shift worker who could point me toward my load. The gravel crunched under my boots as I made my way between the rows of containers, each one marked with company logos and identification numbers that glowed dimly in the ambient light. The temperature was dropping fast, my breath forming clouds in the air, and I pulled my jacket tighter around myself as I walked. That's when I started to notice them, the people scattered throughout the yard, standing among the containers and equipment like statues placed by some avant-garde artist. At first, I thought they were actual statues, or maybe mannequins used for some purpose I couldn't fathom, but as I drew closer to the first one, a man in coveralls holding a clipboard, I realized with a jolt of recognition that it was a real person, standing absolutely motionless, not breathing, not blinking, just frozen in place as if time had stopped for him alone. I reached out, hesitant, and touched his arm. The fabric of his coveralls was cold, stiff, and the flesh beneath felt like chilled meat. His eyes were open, staring at the clipboard in his hands, and there was no consciousness behind them, no awareness at all. He wasn't dead, not exactly, because there was no decay, no smell of mortality. He was simply stopped, paused mid-action like a video that had been frozen on a single frame. My heart began to pound as I backed away from him and started to notice the others. They were everywhere, dozens of them, maybe more, spread throughout the yard in various poses of interrupted activity. A woman in a hard hat stood on the running board of a forklift, one foot on the step, one hand gripping the frame, forever caught in the act of climbing aboard. Two men stood facing each other near a container, their mouths open as if they'd been in mid-conversation when whatever happened to them occurred. A young man in a reflective vest knelt beside a pallet, his hand reaching for a piece of paper that lay on the ground, close enough to touch, but forever beyond his grasp. I walked through the yard in growing horror, cataloging the frozen people, trying to understand what I was seeing. None of them showed signs of violence or struggle. They simply looked like they'd been going about their work when something had stopped them, fixed them in place like insects trapped in amber. Their clothes moved slightly in the breeze, but the people themselves were utterly still, and the longer I looked at them, the more disturbed I became, because there was something about their frozen faces that suggested they were still aware, still conscious, trapped inside bodies that would no longer obey them. The cold was getting worse, and I realized that it wasn't just the autumn chill. The temperature in the yard was dropping rapidly, far faster than natural cooling could account for. The moisture in the air was beginning to crystallize, forming tiny ice crystals that caught the light and gave everything a glittering, dreamlike quality. The ground beneath my feet was hardening, frost spreading across the gravel in intricate patterns that resembled frozen fractals. And the people, the frozen people, were developing a thin coating of ice on their exposed skin, their eyelashes, their hair, as if they were slowly being encased in a crystalline shell. I started to feel it myself. A creeping cold that seemed to come from within rather than without, spreading through my limbs and making my movements sluggish. My thoughts were slowing down, becoming thick and syrupy, and I had to concentrate to remember why I was there, what I was supposed to be doing. Part of me wanted to stop, to stand still, and let the cold take me, because it seemed easier than fighting. Easier than trying to escape whatever had trapped all these other people in this frozen moment. But some deeper instinct kicked in, some primal survival reflex that screamed at me to move, to run, to get away from this place before I became another statue in its collection. I forced my legs to work, stumbling back toward where I'd parked my truck, my breath coming in ragged gasps that hurt my lungs with their coldness. Behind me, I could hear something, a sound like ice forming, like the crackle of frost spreading across glass. And I knew without looking that the freezing effect was following me, trying to catch me, trying to add me to its gallery of trapped souls. I made it to the truck and hauled myself into the cab, fumbling with keys that felt like ice in my fingers. The engine roared to life, bless its mechanical heart, and I threw it into gear and punched the accelerator, the rig lurching forward and sending gravel flying behind the wheels. I didn't look back, didn't slow down, just drove straight through the yard's entrance gate and back onto the highway, putting as much distance as I could between myself and that terrible place. Miles down the road, when the heater had finally warmed the cab and I could feel my fingers and toes again, I pulled over and sat there, shaking, trying to process what I'd witnessed. I called dispatch on a borrowed phone at a truck stop, told them there was a problem at the freight yard, that something was wrong and they needed to send someone to check on it. They said they'd look into it, their tone suggesting they thought I was crazy, or drunk, or both. I never found out what happened to those people. Never heard any news reports about a freight yard full of frozen workers. When I asked dispatch about it weeks later, they claimed they had no record of sending me to that location, that the address I gave them didn't correspond to any facility they worked with. The load I was supposed to pick up had apparently been rerouted to another driver, and there was no paperwork showing I'd ever been assigned to that run. Sometimes I wonder if I imagined the whole thing, if it was some kind of fever dream or hallucination brought on by exhaustion, but I can still see them when I close my eyes. Those frozen people standing in their interrupted moments, and I can still feel the cold that tried to claim me. And sometimes, late at night, when I'm driving through unfamiliar territory, I find myself checking the temperature gauge obsessively, making sure the heater is working, terrified that I'll feel that unnatural cold again and know that I've somehow found my way back to that cursed freight yard, ready to claim me at last. Story 3. The truck stop, where they all called me Driver 66, from Silent Sam. I've always preferred to keep to myself on the road, to drive in silence and speak only when spoken to, a habit that earned me my CB handle years ago when I first started running long-haul routes. Silent Sam, they call me, and I've never minded the nickname because it's accurate enough. I'm not antisocial, exactly, just comfortable with solitude. Content to let the miles roll by without the need for constant conversation or companionship. But there was one truck stop, somewhere in the vast emptiness of Nevada, where my preference for silence became something else entirely, where not speaking became a matter of survival rather than choice. I found the place by accident, or at least that's what I told myself at the time. My usual route had been blocked by an overturned tanker, forcing me onto a detour that took me deeper into the desert than I'd ever ventured before. The sun was setting, painting the landscape in shades of red and orange that made the rocky terrain look like the surface of an alien planet. I'd been driving for hours on roads that seemed to exist more as suggestions than actual thoroughfares, following signs that were half-eared in and barely legible, when I finally saw the lights of the truck stop emerging from the desert. Like a beacon dot, it was a fairly typical setup from the outside. A cluster of buildings centered around fuel pumps, with a diner attached to one side and a small convenience store on the other. The parking lot was nearly full, which surprised me given how remote the location was, but I figured it must be a popular stopover for drivers working this region. I pulled in and found a spot near the back, killed the engine, and sat for a moment in the gathering darkness, letting the silence wash over me before I had to venture out into the noise and light of human interaction. The diner was warm and brightly lit when I entered, filled with the smell of coffee and frying food. It was crowded, every booth and counter stool occupied by drivers in various states of weariness, eating their meals or nursing cups of coffee while they chatted with neighbors or stared off into middle distance. I took a seat at the counter, nodding to the waitress when she approached with a pot of coffee. She was middle-aged, with tired eyes and a practiced smile, and she poured without asking, the way waitresses in truck stops always do, understanding that coffee is less a beverage than a necessity. I was studying the menu when the driver next to me turned and nodded in greeting. He was older, weathered face and gray beard, wearing a cap with the logo of a company I didn't recognize. His name tag incongruously read Driver 66, which I thought was an odd name even for a trucker. He smiled at me, friendly enough, and said something I didn't quite catch over the ambient noise of the diner. I gave a non-committal nod, the way you do when you're not sure what someone said but don't want to seem rude. That's when I noticed that everyone else at the counter was wearing the same name tag, Driver 66, each one identical to the last. I glanced around the diner and saw that the booth occupants were similarly tagged. Dozens of drivers, all apparently sharing the same name or designation. It struck me as strange, maybe some kind of company policy or convention I wasn't aware of, but I've seen stranger things in my years on the road, so I didn't give it too much thought. The waitress returned to take my order, and I pointed to the item on the menu I wanted, the meatloaf special. She nodded and wrote it down, then looked at me expectantly, as if waiting for something else. When I didn't say anything, she frowned slightly and asked, "And what's your name for the order?" I almost opened my mouth to tell her, but something stopped me, some instinct I couldn't quite identify. Instead, I tapped the menu where my order was listed, and shrugged, a gesture that I hoped conveyed that it didn't matter what she called me, as long as I got my food. She hesitated, then wrote something down on her pad and walked away, and I saw several of the nearby drivers turning to look at me with expressions that might have been curiosity, or might have been something less friendly. The driver next to me leaned closer and said, "First time here, Driver 66, using that name like it was mine, like it had always been mine." I nodded, cautious now, sensing that something was off about this place, even if I couldn't articulate exactly what. The meal came, and I ate in silence, while around me the other drivers talked amongst themselves, their conversations washing over me like white noise. I noticed that they never used personal names when addressing each other, only Driver 66, spoken with varying inflections that somehow conveyed different meanings. Driver 66 as a greeting, Driver 66 as a question, Driver 66 as a warning. It was like they developed an entire language using just those two words, and I was an outsider who couldn't speak it. I finished eating and paid my bill, still without speaking, and the waitress gave me a long look as she took my money. Something in her eyes that might have been relief, or might have been disappointment. I couldn't tell which. I left the diner and headed back to my truck, intending to sleep for a few hours before continuing my route. But as I walked through the parking lot, I became aware that I was being followed. Not obviously, but I could sense the presence of other people moving in the darkness behind me, matching my pace, keeping their distance but never quite letting me get too far ahead. I climbed into my cab and locked the doors, heart pounding now, watching through the mirrors as figures moved through the parking lot like shadows given form. They didn't approach my truck directly, but they circled it. These other drivers with their identical name tags, and I could see their faces in the dim light, expressionless and oddly blank. like masks rather than actual faces. One of them placed a hand on my trailer, and I felt the truck rock slightly, as if they were testing its weight or its presence, confirming that it was real and solid. I started the engine, planning to leave immediately, but when I tried to shift into gear, the transmission wouldn't engage. The truck was running fine, all the gauges showing normal, but it was like something was holding it in place, preventing it from moving. Through the windows, I could see more drivers gathering, dozens of them now, all wearing those Driver 66 tags, all staring at my truck with the same blank expressions. One of them, the older driver from the diner, approached my window and gestured for me to roll it down. I couldn't. Some instinct screaming at me to maintain the barrier between us. He waited for a moment, then spoke, his voice muffled by the glass, but still audible. "You have to speak, Driver 66. You have to say the name, that's how you stay." His expression didn't change as he said it, and I had no idea what he meant, what staying entailed, what would happen if I didn't comply. But I knew with absolute certainty that I didn't want to find out. That speaking that name would bind me to this place in some way I couldn't escape. I don't know how long. I sat there in the locked cab, refusing to speak, refusing to acknowledge the drivers who pressed against the truck and whispered through the walls, their voices blending together into a susurrus of Driver 66 repeated endlessly like an incantation. Time seemed to stretch and compress, minutes becoming hours, becoming minutes again, and I might have sat there forever if the sun hadn't finally risen, the dawn light spreading across the desert and driving back the darkness dot with the sunrise. The transmission suddenly engaged, the truck lurching forward as if released from invisible bonds. I drove out of that parking lot without looking back, without stopping, pushing the rig as fast as it would go on those desert roads. Behind me, I could see the truck stop receding in the mirrors, the buildings and pumps and all those gathered drivers, growing smaller and smaller until they vanished into the heat shimmer on the horizon. I never found that truck stop again, though I've driven through that area many times since, always during daylight, always with my radio on to break the silence. I've looked at maps, asked other drivers, even tried to retrace my route from that night, but there's no record of any truck stop in that location, no address or coordinates that correspond to where I remember it being, and I've never told anyone about what happened there, about the drivers who all shared one name and wanted me to share it too, because I'm not sure anyone would believe me, and more than that, I'm afraid that speaking about it might somehow draw it back, might make it real again in a way that allows it to find me. These days, I still drive in silence, still keep to myself, but now it's different. Now, every truck stop I pass, I find myself studying the faces of the other drivers, looking for those blank expressions and identical name tags, terrified that one day I'll see Driver 66 waiting for me at the counter, smiling that empty smile, ready to ask me again to say the name and stay forever, in that place between places where Silent Sam was almost silenced for good. Story 4, the CB. Voice that gave me directions home, but not mine. From Big Rig Bill. The CB radio has been my constant companion for more years than I care to count. A lifeline in the isolation of long-haul trucking. A connection to the invisible community of drivers who share these highways and byways across the country. I've heard every kind of voice come through that speaker, from the professional dispatchers, with their crisp instructions to the lonely drivers, seeking conversation in the dead hours of night. From the pranksters and jokers, to the genuinely helpful souls, who warn of speed traps and accidents ahead. But I'd never heard a voice quite like the one that came through my CB, on a foggy night in northern Michigan. A voice that knew me better than I knew myself, and offered to guide me to a home I'd never seen. I'd been driving for 16 hours straight, pushing the limits of what was legal and well beyond what was safe, trying to make up time after a delay at my last stop. The fog had rolled in around midnight, thick and gray, and suffocating, reducing visibility to almost nothing and forcing me to slow to a crawl. My eyes were burning with exhaustion, my back ached from too many hours in the driver's seat, and I was seriously considering pulling over to rest when the voice first came through the CB, cutting through the static with perfect clarity. "Big Rig Bill," it said, and I remember the chill that ran down my spine when I heard my handle spoken with such familiarity by someone I couldn't identify. "You look tired, friend. I know a shortcut that'll get you home faster. Take the next exit, and I'll guide you in." The voice was warm, masculine, with a fatherly quality that immediately put me at ease, despite my initial surprise. I glanced at the CB, checking to see if I'd accidentally keyed the mic, but it was sitting in its holder, untouched. I should have questioned it more, should have wondered how this stranger knew my handle when I hadn't announced myself, should have been suspicious of unsolicited advice from an unknown source, but exhaustion had dulled my judgment, and the promise of getting home faster was too tempting to ignore. I was still 300 miles from my actual home, a small house in Indiana where my wife would be sleeping in our bed, but the voice had said it with such conviction that I found myself believing it, wanting to believe it. The next exit appeared out of the fog like a ghost, a narrow ramp that I didn't remember from previous runs through this area. I took it, following the curve down into what seemed like even deeper fog, the world outside my windows becoming a featureless gray void. The voice came again, steady and reassuring. "Good, good. Now take a left at the bottom of the ramp. You're doing fine, Bill. I'll get you home safe." I followed the instructions, turning left onto a 2-lane road that seemed to exist in complete isolation from the rest of the world. There were no other vehicles, no buildings, no lights, except for my own headlights cutting weakly through the fog. The road was in poor condition, cracked and potholed, and I had to drive slowly to avoid damaging the rig. But the voice kept up a steady stream of directions and encouragement, telling me where to turn, when to slow down, assuring me that home was getting closer with every mile. After a while, I started to notice things that didn't add up. The landscape outside, when I could glimpse it through breaks in the fog, didn't look like Michigan at all. The trees were wrong, twisted and gnarled in ways that trees shouldn't be, and the terrain was hillier than this part of the state should have been. I tried to check my GPS, but it showed only a blank screen. No map, no location data, just an empty gray field that matched the fog outside. "Don't worry about the GPS, Bill," the voice said, as if it could read my thoughts. "Technology isn't reliable out here, but I am. I know these roads like I know my own hands. Trust me, and I'll get you home." There was something in the way it said home that made me uncomfortable, a weight to the word that suggested it meant something different than what I understood. I keyed the mic, finally finding my voice. "Who is this? How do you know my name?" Static answered me for a long moment, and I thought maybe the connection had been lost. But then the voice returned, still warm, but with an edge now, a hint of something less friendly beneath the fatherly tone. "I'm a friend, Bill. I'm someone who knows the road, who knows where you're meant to be. You've been driving too long, working too hard, staying away from home for too many days and nights. I'm here to help you get back where you belong." The voice paused, and I heard what might have been a soft chuckle. "Keep following my directions. We're almost there." Almost where? I wanted to ask, but I didn't dare, because I was beginning to realize that wherever this voice was leading me, it wasn't to the home I'd left that morning, or the one I'd been picturing in my mind. The fog seemed to be getting thicker, pressing against the windows like it wanted to seep into the cab itself, and the temperature was dropping despite the heater running at full blast. I could see my breath forming clouds in the air, and the steering wheel was cold beneath my hands. The voice continued its directions, and I continued to follow them, because by this point I was completely lost and had no idea how to retrace my route back to the highway. We turned down roads that seemed to narrow with each passing mile, the pavement giving way to gravel and then to dirt, the trees pressing closer on either side until branches scraped against the trailer. This was impossible, I knew, because a semi couldn't navigate roads this narrow. But somehow I kept moving forward, the truck responding to my inputs, despite the physical impossibility of what I was doing. "You're almost home, Bill," the voice said, and now it sounded triumphant, excited in a way that made my blood run cold. "Just around this next bend, you'll see it. The home you've been missing all your life, the place where you really belong, not that house in Indiana, with the wife who barely remembers what you look like. Not that life of endless driving and temporary stops. Your real home, Bill, the one that's been waiting for you." I came around the bend and saw it through the fog. A house that I'd never seen before, but somehow recognized. A structure that seemed both familiar and alien at the same time. It was old, maybe Victorian in style, with a wraparound porch and windows that glowed with warm yellow light. There was smoke coming from the chimney, and I could almost smell it. That comforting scent of wood fire that speaks of warmth and safety. The driveway leading up to it was just wide enough for my truck, and I found myself turning toward it, drawn by something I couldn't name. But as I got closer, I started to see the details that the fog and distance had hidden. The porch was rotted, sagging in places where the supports had given way. The windows weren't glowing with warm light, but with something else. Something that moved and flickered in ways that firelight shouldn't. The smoke from the chimney was too dark, too thick, and it didn't rise into the air, but hung there, motionless, defying physics and common sense. And there were figures on the porch. I could see them now, standing still as statues, watching my approach. "Stop the truck," I said aloud, to myself more than to the voice, and I slammed on the brakes. The rig shuddered to a halt, the trailer fishtailing slightly on the dirt driveway. My heart was hammering in my chest, and I could feel sweat running down my back, despite the cold. On the CB, the voice was still speaking, but the warm, fatherly tone was gone now, replaced by something harsh and demanding. "Don't stop, Bill. You're so close. Just a little further, and you'll be home. You'll never have to drive again. Never have to be alone again. Everything you've been looking for is right there, waiting for you. All you have to do is park the truck and walk to the door." I looked at the house again, at the figures on the porch who I realized were wearing truckers' caps and jackets. Other drivers who'd maybe followed this voice to this place and never left. I looked at the windows with their impossible light, at the smoke that hung frozen in the air, and I made a decision. I threw the truck into reverse, the transmission protesting but obeying, and I backed away from that house as fast as I dared. The voice on the CB erupted into incoherent shouting, all pretense of friendliness gone, cursing and demanding that I return, that I complete the journey. But I ignored it, backing down the narrow drive until I could turn around, then driving forward, retracing my route by memory and instinct more than by sight. The fog began to thin as I drove, the roads gradually widening and improving, and eventually I found myself back on the exit ramp, heading up toward the highway. The voice had fallen silent, replaced by normal CB chatter from other drivers, ordinary conversations about ordinary things. I merged back onto the highway and drove through the rest of the night in a daze, not stopping until I reached a truck stop I recognized, a place I'd been to dozens of times before. I never told my wife about what happened, couldn't explain it in any way that would make sense. But I sold the truck a month later and took a local driving job, running deliveries within a 50-mile radius of home, routes I could complete in a single day without ever spending a night on the road. I still have nightmares sometimes, dreams where I'm following that voice again, getting closer and closer to that impossible house, and I wake up sweating and disoriented, needing to look around and confirm that I'm in my own bedroom, in my own home, the real one, the one I chose. And I never use the CB radio anymore, not even in the day cab I drive now. because I'm afraid that if I turn it on, I'll hear that voice again, still warm and friendly and patient, still offering to guide me home to a place I was never meant to find. Story 5. The Box That Knocked Back. From Rust Belt Ron. There's a particular kind of freight that experienced drivers learn to recognize. Cargo that comes with instructions just vague enough to make you nervous. Pickup locations that feel wrong even when everything looks normal. And delivery addresses that don't quite match any map you can find. In my 30 years of hauling, I've carried plenty of loads that made me wonder what exactly I was transporting. But I learned early on not to ask too many questions, because the money was good and the answers were rarely satisfying. The box that knocked back, though, that was different from anything I'd encountered before, because it wasn't just mysterious or suspicious. It was actively trying to communicate, and I've spent every day since wondering what would have happened if I'd listened to what it was trying to say. The pickup was at a warehouse in the industrial section of Detroit, one of those vast anonymous buildings that could contain anything from automotive parts to expired pharmaceuticals, the kind of place where forklifts echo in empty spaces and the workers never quite meet your eyes. The dispatcher had given me minimal information, just an address and a time window, with a note that the cargo was fragile and time-sensitive. When I arrived, there was only one box waiting for me, a wooden crate about 6 feet long and 3 feet on each side, secured with metal bands and marked with symbols I didn't recognize, characters that might have been Arabic or might have been something else entirely. Flowing script that seemed to writhe when I looked at it too directly. The warehouse supervisor who met me was a nervous man in his 50s, with sweat stains under his arms despite the cool temperature, and he seemed eager to have the crate loaded and gone. He gave me the paperwork, standard bill of lading with destination coordinates rather than a street address, and he made me sign 3 different liability waivers before he'd let his crew bring the forklift around. They loaded it carefully, those workers, treating the crate like it might explode at any moment, securing it in the center of the trailer with enough straps and padding to hold down something 10 times its weight. "Drive steady," the supervisor told me as I was preparing to leave, his hand on my truck's door like he wanted to hold me there a moment longer. "No sudden stops, no rough roads if you can help it, and don't open the trailer once you're loaded. The climate control is set exactly where it needs to be, and if you break the seal for any reason, the cargo will be compromised." He paused, licking his lips nervously. "And if you hear anything at all coming from the back, just keep driving. Don't stop to investigate. Whatever you hear, it's normal. It's part of the process." I should have walked away right then, should have refused the load and taken the hit to my reputation, but the pay was triple my normal rate for a run, half the distance. Enough money to finally fix the transmission issues in my personal truck and maybe take the wife on that vacation she'd been wanting. So I nodded, climbed into the cab, and pulled out of the warehouse lot, the weight of that single crate barely registering on my rig despite its careful securing, as if whatever was inside weighed almost nothing at all. The first few hours passed without incident, smooth highway driving through the Michigan countryside, the trailer climate control humming steadily behind me, maintaining whatever precise temperature the cargo required. I had the radio on, classic country filling the cab, and I was thinking about where I'd take my wife on vacation, maybe Florida, maybe out west to see the mountains, when I heard the first knock. It was distinct, unmistakable, 3 sharp raps that came through the wall, separating the cab from the trailer, a sound that made me jump and glance in the rearview mirror, even though I couldn't see into the sealed trailer from my position. I told myself it was just the cargo settling, the crate shifting slightly despite the straps as we went over an uneven patch of road. Freight makes noise sometimes, especially wooden crates that expand and contract with temperature changes. I turned up the radio and tried to ignore it, but 10 minutes later, it came again. 3 more knocks, identical to the first, deliberate and measured, like someone rapping on a door asking to be let in. This time, I couldn't dismiss it as settling cargo, because the rhythm was too precise, too purposeful, and it seemed to be coming from inside the crate itself, rather than from the crate moving against something else. I checked the trailer camera on my dashboard display, a fisheye view of the cargo area that showed the crate exactly where it had been loaded. Straps tight, padding secure, nothing visibly wrong. But as I watched, the 3 knocks came again, and I saw the crate shudder slightly with each impact, as if something inside was striking the wooden walls from within. The camera couldn't see through the wood, couldn't tell me what was causing the movement, but it confirmed that I wasn't imagining things, that something was definitely happening back there. The supervisor's words came back to me, his insistence that any sounds were normal, part of the process, and I gripped the steering wheel tighter and forced myself to keep driving. Whatever was in that crate, it wasn't my business. I was just the delivery driver, paid to transport cargo from point A to point B without asking questions. If the client wanted something that knocked on crate walls, that was their concern, not mine. But the knocking continued, establishing a pattern over the next hour that I couldn't ignore. 3 knocks, a pause, then 2 knocks, another pause, then 1 knock, followed by silence for about 15 minutes before the whole sequence would repeat. It was too regular to be random, too consistent to be just cargo shifting or wood expanding. It was a code, I realized, or an attempt at communication. Something inside that crate trying to convey information using the only method available to it. I tried to focus on the road, on the GPS coordinates that were leading me deeper into rural Ohio, into countryside that grew increasingly empty as the afternoon wore on. The delivery location was at least 3 hours away, still, and the sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon, painting the sky in those familiar shades of orange and red that usually brought me comfort, but now seemed ominous, as if the day itself was warning me about what might wait in the darkness. The knocking changed as evening fell, becoming more urgent, the 3-2-1 pattern speeding up and sometimes varying, adding knocks or changing their rhythm in ways that suggested growing desperation. I found myself counting them, trying to decipher meaning from the patterns, wondering what message this trapped thing was trying to send. Was it asking for help, warning me about something, or just confirming that it was aware, conscious, trapped in that wooden prison, and trying to reach someone, anyone, who might acknowledge its existence? Around 8 o'clock, as full darkness settled over the highway, the knocking suddenly stopped. The silence was almost worse than the sound had been, because I'd grown accustomed to the rhythm, had built my driving around the expectation of those regular interruptions. Now there was nothing, just the hum of the engine and the whisper of tires on asphalt, and I found myself watching the trailer camera obsessively, waiting for some sign of movement from the crate. When the knocking resumed, it was different, no longer following the 3-2-1 pattern, but coming in rapid bursts. Dozens of impacts in quick succession, like someone pounding on the walls with both fists in panic or rage. The crate was shaking visibly on the camera now, the straps straining against whatever force was being exerted from within, and I could hear the wood beginning to crack. Not loudly, but with small splitting sounds that suggested the container's integrity was being compromised. I pulled over on the shoulder of the highway, my heart racing, breaking the supervisor's explicit instructions, but unable to continue driving while whatever was happening in my trailer escalated toward some unknown conclusion. With the engine idling, I sat in the cab and watched the camera display, mesmerized and horrified as the crate continued to shake. The knocking now so rapid and violent that it had become a continuous roar, like thunder rolling through the trailer. Then it stopped again, abruptly, and I saw one side of the crate begin to bulge outward, the wood bending in a way that wooden planks shouldn't bend, pushing against the straps until I thought they would snap. Something was pressing from inside, testing the strength of its container, searching for a weak point that might allow escape. The bulge grew larger, taking on a shape that might have been an arm or a leg or something else entirely. Something that didn't quite match human proportions, but was trying to approximate them. I grabbed my phone, intending to call the supervisor, the dispatcher, someone who could tell me what to do, but before I could dial, the bulge withdrew and the crate settled back to its normal shape, the wood creaking as it returned to its original configuration. The knocking started again, but gentler now, back to the 3-2-1 pattern, but slower, almost tentative, as if whatever was inside had exhausted itself with its escape attempt and was now trying a different approach. I sat there for a long time, maybe 20 minutes, listening to that patient knocking and trying to decide what to do. The rational part of my brain said to just deliver the cargo and be done with it, to complete the job and collect my money and never think about it again. But another part of me, the part that still believed in basic human decency, wondered what I was delivering and whether I had any moral responsibility to intervene, to open that crate and see what was inside, to potentially free whatever was trapped there. In the end, fear won out over curiosity and conscience. I put the truck back in gear and continued toward the delivery coordinates, following the GPS as it led me off the highway and onto progressively smaller roads, eventually turning onto a dirt track that wound through dense forest. The knocking continued throughout the journey, maintaining its steady 3-2-1 rhythm, and I found myself knocking back once, 3 raps on the wall separating me from the trailer, acknowledging the communication even though I had no idea what it meant or what I was acknowledging. The knocking stopped immediately when I responded, and for a full minute there was complete silence. Then it resumed, but changed. 5 knocks in rapid succession, then a pause, then 5 more knocks. It repeated this pattern several times before I understood that it was responding to my response, that whatever was in that crate had recognized my knock as communication and was trying to establish a dialogue. My hands were shaking on the steering wheel as I realized I'd made contact with something, had confirmed my presence to whatever intelligence was trapped in my trailer, and I had no idea what consequences that simple gesture might bring. The delivery location was a clearing in the forest, lit by portable floodlights that had been set up around a large tent structure. Several vehicles were parked nearby, expensive SUVs and a panel van, and there were people moving around in the harsh artificial light. Men in dark suits who looked more like security contractors than warehouse workers. They flagged me down before I could even fully enter the clearing, directing me to back up to the tent entrance, where a loading dock had been temporarily erected. I climbed down from the cab on shaking legs, and a man in a particularly expensive suit approached me with a clipboard and a cold smile. "Any problems during transport?" he asked, his tone suggesting that the correct answer was no. I thought about the knocking, about the bulging wood and the communication attempts, about the 5-knock response to my acknowledgement. I thought about saying something, about refusing to hand over cargo that was clearly alive and conscious and trying to reach out. "No problems," I heard myself say, and I signed the papers he handed me, releasing custody of the crate and whatever it contained. The money was already being transferred to my account. I could see the notification on my phone, triple the normal rate, just like they'd promised. The workers moved efficiently to unload the crate, carrying it into the tent where I couldn't see what happened next, and the man in the suit handed me a thick envelope full of cash as a bonus, hush money more likely, payment for not asking questions and not telling stories. I drove away from that clearing as fast as the dirt roads would allow, not looking back, trying not to think about what I'd just delivered or what would happen to it in that tent in the forest. The trailer was empty now, the climate control shut down, no more knocking to mark my journey. But the silence felt accusatory, heavy with the weight of whatever choice I'd made when I'd chosen money over investigation, when I'd acknowledged that things attempt at communication, but then delivered it to its destination anyway. I never took another questionable load after that night. Turned down jobs that came with too many warnings or too little information or too much money for too simple a task. The transmission in my personal truck is still broken, and my wife is still waiting for that vacation. But some prices are too high to pay, and some cargo isn't worth carrying no matter what they offer. Because late at night, when I'm trying to sleep, I still hear that knocking, the 3-2-1 pattern that became 5 knocks when I responded, and I wonder what it was trying to tell me, what message I failed to understand, and whether somewhere in a tent in a forest, something is still knocking, still trying to communicate, still hoping that someone will finally listen and understand and help. Story 6. The road that smelled like gasoline and perfume from Redneck Rick. Spend enough time on the highways of America and you start to notice that certain roads have their own personalities, their own distinct characteristics that set them apart from the thousands of miles of asphalt that crisscross this country. Some roads are angry, full of aggressive drivers and endless construction. Some are lonely, stretching through empty country where you can drive for hours without seeing another soul. And some roads are just strange, marked by qualities that you can't quite explain, but that you recognize immediately when you encounter them again. The road that smelled like gasoline and perfume was one of those strange ones. A stretch of highway in Louisiana that I've driven past 100 times since, but have never quite been able to find again, though I've tried, despite every instinct telling me I should leave it lost. It was summer, the thick humid heat of the Gulf Coast making the air shimmer and turning the inside of my cab into a sauna. Despite the air conditioning running full blast, I was hauling a load of furniture from Houston to Mobile. Standard interstate driving that should have been straightforward and boring. The kind of run you can do half asleep because you've done it so many times before. But somewhere in the swamps of Louisiana, I took a wrong turn, followed my GPS down an exit I didn't remember, and found myself on a 2-lane road that wound through cypress forests and stagnant water. A road that seemed older than the interstate system, like it had existed long before the modern highways and was just waiting for drivers like me to make a mistake and find their way to it. The smell hit me first, before I even rolled down the window, seeping into the cab through the vents with the recycled air. It was gasoline, unmistakably, that sharp petroleum scent that usually means a tanker accident or a leaking fuel tank, and my first instinct was to look for smoke or fire, scanning the road ahead for signs of trouble. But there was nothing, just that empty highway winding through the swamp, and the smell kept getting stronger, filling the cab until my eyes were watering and I was reaching for the window controls to let in fresh air. When I cracked the window, the smell changed, or rather, it expanded, because now mixed with the gasoline was perfume, sweet and cloying and distinctly feminine, the kind of heavy floral scent that women wore in the 80s. All gardenias and jasmine and something musky underneath. The combination was nauseating. These two completely disparate odors blending together into something that shouldn't exist, and I found myself breathing through my mouth, trying not to inhale too deeply while I looked for a place to turn around, but there was nowhere to turn. No side roads or driveways, just solid cypress forest on one side and murky swamp water on the other. And the road kept winding forward, never straight enough to see more than a quarter mile ahead, never offering an opportunity to reverse course. I told myself I'd find a place eventually, that I just needed to keep driving until the road widened or intersected with something else. But the minutes stretched into an hour and I was still on that same winding highway, still breathing that impossible mixture of gasoline and perfume, and starting to realize that I might have stumbled onto something more complicated than a simple wrong turn. The sun was beginning to set, throwing long shadows across the road, and in the fading light, I started to see things at the edges of my vision. Shapes that might have been trees, or might have been something else. Figures standing in the shallow water of the swamp, or walking parallel to the road just inside the tree line. Every time I looked directly at them, they resolved into perfectly normal vegetation, cypress knees and hanging moss, and the occasional bird taking flight. But in my peripheral vision they remained humanoid, watching my progress, keeping pace with my truck. The smell was getting worse. Or maybe I was just becoming more aware of it. The gasoline component growing more acrid, while the perfume turned sickly sweet, like flowers left too long in a vase, rotting in stagnant water. I tried closing all the vents, turning off the air conditioning entirely, but the smell persisted, and I realized with growing unease that it wasn't coming from outside at all, but was somehow emanating from inside the cab itself, as if the truck had absorbed it and was now releasing it from every surface. That's when I noticed the woman in the passenger seat, and I swear to you I don't know how I didn't see her before, because she was sitting right there, as solid and present as any living person, wearing a sundress from another era, her hair styled in victory rolls that hadn't been fashionable since the 40s. She wasn't looking at me, just staring straight ahead through the windshield, her hands folded primly in her lap, and she was the source of the perfume, I could tell. That overwhelming floral scent radiating from her like heat from pavement. I jerked the wheel instinctively, the truck swerving before I corrected, my heart hammering in my chest as I tried to process what I was seeing. "Who the hell are you?" I managed to say, my voice coming out rougher than I intended, and she turned to look at me then, her face beautiful and terrible, makeup perfectly applied, but somehow wrong. Like a porcelain doll's face painted to approximate life without quite achieving it. "You took the wrong road," she said, her voice carrying a faint accent I couldn't place, somewhere between Southern Belle and something older, more foreign. "This road isn't for you, but you're here now, and that means you have to see it through." She gestured ahead, where the highway continued its endless winding through the swamp. "Keep driving. We're almost there." Almost where? I wanted to ask, but I couldn't find my voice. Couldn't do anything but grip the steering wheel and try to focus on keeping the truck on the road, while this impossible woman sat beside me, filling the cab with her perfume and her presence. The gasoline smell was stronger now, and I realized it was coming from her too, as if she'd been soaked in fuel, as if at any moment she might ignite and take us both up in flames. The landscape outside was changing, the swamp giving way to what looked like an old town, buildings emerging from the shadows, structures that might have been houses, or stores, or churches, all of them dark and abandoned, windows empty, and doors hanging open. The road widened slightly, becoming a main street through this ghost town, and I could see more figures now. People standing on the sidewalks, or sitting on porches, all of them watching my truck pass. All of them wearing clothes from different eras, different decades spanning what must have been 100 years of fashion. "This is where we ended up," the woman said, still staring ahead. "All of us who took the wrong road, who made the wrong turn, who followed the smell of gasoline and perfume when we should have known better." She gestured at the watching figures. "Some of us crashed, burned up in our vehicles on this stretch of highway. Some of us just got lost and never found our way back. But we all ended up here, in this place between places, this town that exists only for those who take the wrong road." I wanted to stop the truck, to jump out and run, but I couldn't seem to make my body obey. Couldn't do anything but keep driving through this impossible town, while the woman beside me continued her explanation. "You can join us, if you want," she said, turning those painted doll eyes toward me again. "Stop the truck, get out, and you'll never have to drive again. Never have to worry about deliveries, or schedules, or going home. You can just stay here, where time doesn't pass, and nothing ever changes." The thought was tempting in a way I hadn't expected. The idea of simply stopping, of letting go of all the responsibilities and pressures that came with my job, my life, my constant movement from place to place. I could see the appeal of this frozen town, this permanent rest stop, where the residents never had to leave or arrive, just existed in an eternal present. But then I thought about my family, about the people waiting for me to come home, about all the miles I still had to drive, and all the places I still wanted to see, and I found my voice again. "No," I said, the word coming out firm and clear. I'm not staying. I need to get back to the real road, the real world. I need to finish my delivery and go home. I looked at her directly, meeting those unsettling eyes. Tell me how to get out of here. She was silent for a long moment, her expression unreadable, and I thought maybe she would refuse. Maybe she would try to force me to stay, or punish me for rejecting her offer. But then she smiled, sad and understanding, and pointed ahead to where the town was ending, the buildings giving way to open swamp again. Keep driving, she said. Don't stop, don't look back, and when you reach the next intersection, take the left fork. It'll lead you back to the interstate, back to your regular route. But remember, the road is always here, waiting for those who take a wrong turn, and next time you might not be able to refuse. The town fell away behind us, and with it, the watching figures and the impossible buildings, the landscape returning to normal, swamp and forest. The woman in the passenger seat was fading too, becoming translucent, her perfume fading even as the gasoline smell intensified one last time, a final overwhelming wave that made me gag. Then she was gone completely, and I was alone in the cab. The air conditioning running normally, no trace of her presence except for the lingering memory and a faint floral scent that might have been imagination. The intersection appeared exactly where she'd said it would be, and I took the left fork without hesitation, following the road as it curved and straightened and eventually merged back onto the interstate, depositing me exactly where I should have been if I'd never taken that wrong exit. The GPS recalculated, showing me on my proper route, and the sun finished setting in a normal way, without shadows that looked like people or buildings that appeared from nowhere. I delivered my load to Mobile on time, never mentioning the detour or the lost hours that somehow hadn't affected my schedule. But I couldn't forget that road, that impossible town, the woman who smelled like gasoline and perfume and offered me eternal rest in exchange for giving up my life. And sometimes, when I'm driving through Louisiana, I catch a whiff of that combination, gasoline and flowers mixed together in a way that shouldn't be possible, and I know the road is calling to me again, inviting me to take another wrong turn and see where it leads. But I never do, haven't yet, though I feel the pull of it, the temptation to find that place again, and maybe this time accept the offer, to stop driving and stop moving and just exist in that frozen moment between arriving and leaving. Because the truth is, there are days when the road feels endless, when the miles stretch out forever and home seems impossibly far away. And on those days, the idea of a place where you never have to drive again, where you can just rest forever in the smell of gasoline and perfume, doesn't seem quite as terrible as it probably should. Story 7. The customer who waited inside my dreams from Outlaw Owen. Sleep is a precious commodity in the trucking industry, something you grab in whatever increments you can manage. Pulling over at rest stops or truck stops for a few hours of restless unconsciousness, before the demands of the schedule force you back behind the wheel. Most drivers develop the ability to sleep anywhere, to shut down their minds and bodies, regardless of the noise or light or uncomfortable conditions, because the alternative is exhaustion so profound it becomes dangerous. I learned to sleep in truck cabs years ago, developed a routine of checking my load, locking the doors, setting an alarm, and letting myself drift off regardless of where I was or what was happening around me. But there was one delivery, one customer waiting at the end of a long haul, who found their way into my dreams before I ever reached their location, and I've never been entirely certain whether what happened was purely in my head or whether something stranger was occurring during those sleeping hours. The run started in Seattle, a load of electronics heading to a distribution center in a small town in Montana, coordinates that placed it somewhere in the mountains where civilization thinned out and gave way to wilderness. It was a 3-day drive, accounting for the mandatory rest periods and the mountain passes that would slow me down, and I set out in good spirits, the weather clear and the truck running smoothly. The first night, I stopped at a rest area in Idaho, backing into a spot away from the other trucks, preferring isolation to company when I slept. I fell asleep easily, the way I always do after a long day of driving, my body grateful for the horizontal position and the temporary cessation of vibrations and engine noise. But the dream that came was unusual, vivid in a way that dreams rarely are, full of specific details that seemed too concrete to be products of my subconscious. I dreamed I was still in the truck, still parked at the rest area, but it was fully dark outside now. The kind of absolute darkness you only find far from cities, where the stars are so bright they seem close enough to touch. In the dream, someone knocked on my door, 3 gentle taps that somehow managed to penetrate both my sleep and the locked metal barrier between the cab and the outside world. I sat up, or dreamed I sat up, the distinction unclear, and looked toward the driver's side window. A man stood there, middle-aged and unremarkable, wearing clothes that seemed simultaneously contemporary and oddly dated, as if he'd dressed from a thrift store without paying attention to what decade the garments came from. He smiled at me and gestured for me to roll down the window. I should have known it was a dream right then, should have recognized the impossibility of the situation and used that awareness to wake myself up. But dreams have their own logic, and in that logic, it made perfect sense to roll down the window and speak to this stranger in the middle of the night at a deserted rest area. "Can I help you?" I heard myself ask, and the man's smile widened. "I'm your customer," he said, his voice pleasant and ordinary. "I'm the one you're delivering to, up in Montana. I just wanted to introduce myself, let you know I'm waiting for you." He leaned closer to the window, and I could smell something on him, earth and pine, and something metallic underneath. "I've been waiting a long time for this delivery, Owen. Years, actually. And I wanted to make sure you'd actually show up, that you wouldn't get cold feet or take a different route." In the dream, this seemed reasonable, and I found myself nodding, assuring him that I'd be there, that I always completed my deliveries. He seemed satisfied with this answer, stepping back from the truck and giving me a small wave. "I'll see you soon," he said, and then he was gone, walking into the darkness beyond the reach of the rest area lights, and I was lying back down, closing my eyes, falling into deeper sleep within the dream itself, layers of unconsciousness stacking on top of each other. I woke with the alarm, groggy and disoriented, the dream clinging to my consciousness like cobwebs. It had felt so real, so specific, that I found myself checking the driver's side window, half expecting to see fingerprints or some evidence of the man's presence. But the window was clean, unmarked, and when I climbed down from the cab and looked around the rest area in the gray light of dawn, there was no one matching his description among the few other drivers who were stirring. I dismissed it as just a vivid dream, the product of a mind processing the details of the delivery ahead, and I continued on my route, driving through Idaho and into Montana as the landscape grew more mountainous and the towns grew smaller and farther apart. That night, I stopped at a truck stop near Missoula, repeating my usual routine, locking the doors and setting my alarm before letting sleep claim me. The man was waiting in my dreams again, but this time he was sitting in the passenger seat of my truck. There, when I opened my eyes in the dream, as if he'd been riding along with me all day, without my knowledge. "Getting closer," he said conversationally, as if we were old friends, continuing a discussion from earlier. "Only one more day of driving, and then you'll reach me. I have to admit, I'm getting excited. It's been so long since I had a delivery, since anyone came all the way out here." In the dream, I asked him what exactly I was delivering, because the manifest had listed only electronics, generic items, without specific details. He laughed at this, a sound that was almost but not quite right, like an imperfect imitation of human laughter. "You're not delivering the cargo," he said, his smile never wavering. "You're delivering yourself. The cargo is just an excuse, a reason to get you to come to where I am. I've been calling drivers for years, sending out jobs, waiting for someone to actually complete the delivery. I should have been afraid, would have been in waking life, but dreams have a way of muffling appropriate emotional responses, and instead, I just felt curious, asking him why he needed someone to come to him. what he wanted with me or any other driver. He leaned back in the seat, getting comfortable, and the way he moved reminded me of a predator settling in to watch its prey, patient and confident. "I'm lonely," he said simply. "I've been alone up in these mountains for longer than I care to remember, and I need company. Fresh company. Someone who can tell me about the world outside, about the highways and the cities, and all the places I can't go anymore." The conversation continued, though I can't remember all the details now. The specifics fading the way dream conversations do, leaving only impressions and emotions. But I remember the growing sense of unease, the feeling that this was more than just a dream, that somehow this man was actually reaching out to me across distance and the barrier between waking and sleeping, preparing me for what I would find when I reached the delivery location. I woke up with my heart pounding, the dream leaving me shaken in a way that I couldn't entirely explain. The logical part of my brain insisted it was just stress, just my subconscious mind playing tricks, manufacturing anxiety about a routine delivery. But another part of me, the part that had driven enough lonely roads and seen enough strange things to know that the world is wider and weirder than most people believe, wondered if something else was happening, if this customer was somehow more than just a man waiting for a delivery. I almost turned back that morning, almost called the dispatcher and told them I was sick, or that the truck had mechanical problems. Any excuse to avoid completing this run. But pride and professionalism and a lifetime of seeing jobs through to completion pushed me forward, and I got back on the highway, following the GPS coordinates toward that remote location in the Montana mountains. The final leg of the journey took me deeper into wilderness than I'd expected, the paved roads giving way to gravel and eventually to dirt. The forest pressing close on both sides, branches scraping against the trailer as I navigated the narrow track. The GPS insisted I was going the right way, but there was no sign of any distribution center, no buildings or structures at all, just endless trees and the rough road climbing higher into the mountains. I should have turned back then, should have recognized that something was wrong, but I kept driving, compelled by something I couldn't name, following the coordinates to their exact destination. The road ended in a small clearing, surrounded by ancient trees, and containing nothing but a single small cabin, weathered and dark, with windows that reflected the afternoon light in ways that made them look less like glass and more like eyes. I parked the truck and sat there for a long moment, engine idling, debating what to do. This clearly wasn't a distribution center, wasn't any legitimate delivery location. I should leave, I knew, should back up the truck and get out of there as fast as the narrow road would allow. But I was curious now, needed to understand what was happening, why someone had created a fake delivery just to lure me to this remote location. The cabin door opened before I could make a decision, and the man from my dreams stepped out, looking exactly as he had in my sleep, wearing the same mismatched clothes and the same pleasant smile. He waved at me, friendly and welcoming, and called out in that same ordinary voice I'd heard in my dreams, "Owen, you made it. Come on in, let's get you signed off on this delivery." I climbed down from the cab, every instinct screaming at me to get back in and drive away, but my feet carried me toward the cabin, toward the waiting man who claimed to be my customer. Up close, I could see the details I'd missed in my dreams. The way his skin had an odd waxy quality, the way his eyes didn't quite focus correctly, tracking my movements slightly too slowly, like a video playing at the wrong frame rate. "I've been waiting for you," he said, stepping back to let me enter the cabin, and I found myself crossing the threshold, entering the dark interior, where furniture huddled in shadows, and the air smelled like old wood and older things. Waited in your dreams, waited in this place, waited for someone to finally complete the delivery, and come all the way out here to where I am. The cabin door swung shut behind me, and I heard it lock, a solid mechanical sound that seemed to echo in the enclosed space. The man gestured toward a chair, inviting me to sit, and I realized that I'd made a terrible mistake, that the dreams had been warnings rather than preparations. my subconscious trying to tell me what I was walking into, while my conscious mind ignored the signs. But then, impossibly, I was back in my truck, sitting in the driver's seat, with the engine still idling, parked in that clearing with the cabin visible through the windshield. The man was standing in the doorway, still smiling, still waving, but I hadn't left the truck, hadn't accepted his invitation, hadn't crossed that threshold. Had I dreamed the approach to the cabin? Was I still dreaming now? The line between sleep and waking had become so blurred that I couldn't tell what was real and what was happening in my head. I threw the truck into reverse, not caring about the narrow road or the difficulty of backing up, just needing to get away from that cabin and that man and whatever he wanted from me. The truck responded, backing down the track with grinding precision, branches scraping and rocks crunching under the tires. In the mirrors, I could see the man still standing in the doorway, not following, not trying to stop me, just watching with that patient smile, as if he knew that, whether I left now or stayed, it didn't matter, because he'd already gotten what he wanted, already established a connection through those dream visits that would persist, regardless of physical distance. I drove 4 hours without stopping, not pausing until I was back on paved roads, back in areas where cell service worked and other vehicles shared the highway. I called the dispatcher, reported that the delivery location was fake, that there was no distribution center at those coordinates. They seemed confused, checked their records, and told me that the job had been canceled hours ago, that I should have received notification, that I wasn't supposed to have gone to Montana at all. The paperwork showed a last-minute change, a different destination, a different customer, all of it updated before I'd even left Seattle. But I'd never received a notification, had driven all the way to that cabin based on outdated information or following directions that existed only in my dreams. The company apologized, paid me for the wasted time and mileage, and that was the end of it from their perspective, but not from mine. Because the man still visits my dreams sometimes, appearing in the passenger seat, or standing at rest areas, or waiting in the distance when I wake in unfamiliar places. He never speaks anymore, just smiles that patient smile and waves, reminding me that he's still waiting, still lonely, still hoping that one day I'll complete the delivery and bring him the company he craves. And the worst part is that sometimes, in the depths of exhausted sleep, I find myself promising I'll go back, I'll visit, I'll keep him company in that lonely cabin in the mountains, and I wake up terrified that one night I'll make that promise with conviction, strong enough to override my waking judgment, and I'll find myself driving back to those coordinates, back to that clearing, ready to finally complete the delivery and discover what it means to become a customer's permanent guest. Story 8. The rest stop built over a cemetery from Iron Ike. Highway rest stops are usually anonymous places, designed for function rather than character, offering tired drivers a place to stretch their legs, use the facilities, and maybe grab a snack from a vending machine before returning to the road. After driving for 40 years, I've stopped at hundreds of them, maybe thousands, and they all blur together in memory. Indistinguishable collections of parking spaces and picnic tables and bathrooms that smell like industrial cleaner and neglect. But there was one rest stop in Pennsylvania, on a lonely stretch of highway between Pittsburgh and Harrisburg, that stood out from all the others, not because of anything unusual about its construction or maintenance, but because of what I learned had been built beneath it, and what still remained there, waiting in the ground for drivers like me, who might be sensitive enough to notice. I pulled in late, on an October evening, the kind of night when autumn is asserting its dominance over the fading summer. The air crisp and the leaves turning colors that looked black in the insufficient lighting of the rest area. I'd been driving since dawn, hauling machine parts from Ohio to Philadelphia, and I needed to log some rest hours before continuing. The rest stop was nearly empty, just a couple of cars in the lot, and one other semi parked at the far end, which suited me fine. I preferred solitude when I stopped, time to decompress without the social obligation of chatting with other drivers. I parked and sat in the cab for a moment, listening to the engine tick as it cooled, watching the few other people at the rest stop moving between their vehicles and the bathroom building. There was something about the place that felt off, though I couldn't have articulated what exactly was bothering me. The lighting seemed dimmer than it should be, or maybe it was just that the shadows were darker, pooling in places where shadows shouldn't be able to accumulate. The air had a weight to it, a thickness that made breathing feel like work, and there was a smell, faint but persistent, like turned earth and old flowers, the kind of scent you associate with graveyards and funerals. I climbed down from the cab, stretching muscles that had been cramped for too long, and made my way toward the bathroom building. As I walked across the parking lot, I noticed something strange about the pavement beneath my feet. It was covered in cracks, which wasn't unusual for highway infrastructure. But these cracks formed patterns, geometric shapes that seemed too regular to be random, as if someone had deliberately scored the asphalt to mark specific locations. The patterns repeated every few feet, roughly rectangular, roughly the size of... I stopped walking, understanding hitting me like cold water. Graves. The patterns were the size and shape of graves, marked out in the pavement as if someone wanted to indicate what lay beneath, or couldn't help but have the truth of it show through, despite attempts to cover it up. Inside the bathroom building, the fluorescent lights flickered and hummed, casting uncertain illumination on tile walls that were clean but somehow felt dirty, as if no amount of scrubbing could remove whatever residue clung to them. I was washing my hands when I noticed the graffiti on the wall above the sink, scratched into the paint with something sharp, words that sent a chill down my spine. They're still here. They didn't move them all. They're still here under your feet. I stared at those scratched words for a long moment, my wet hands dripping water onto the floor, trying to convince myself it was just typical rest stop graffiti, the kind of creepy nonsense that bored travelers carved into walls to entertain themselves or unsettle others. But combined with the patterns in the pavement and that persistent smell of earth and decay, the words felt less like a prank and more like a warning, something important that someone had felt compelled to leave behind for drivers like me who might notice the strangeness of this place. Back outside, the rest stop felt even more oppressive, the shadows having somehow grown deeper in the few minutes I'd been inside. The other vehicles that had been there when I arrived were gone now, leaving only my truck and that other semi parked at the far end of the lot. The silence was profound, broken only by the distant sound of traffic on the highway, a rushing whisper that seemed to come from very far away, despite the road being less than 100 yards distant. I walked toward the picnic area, drawn by curiosity. I should have resisted, following a paved path that wound between concrete tables and grills that looked like they hadn't been used in years. There was a historical marker near the path, one of those state-issued plaques that tell you about significant events or locations, and I stopped to read it in the dim light. The words were simple and factual, stating that this rest stop had been built in 1973 on land that had previously been the site of the Mercy Hill Cemetery, established in 1842 and used until 1968, when the highway expansion had required the relocation of the remains to a newer facility 3 miles north. Relocation of the remains. That clinical phrase covered a multitude of actions, the digging up of bodies that had been resting for over a century, the careful or not so careful removal of bones and caskets and whatever else remained of the people who'd been buried there. And according to the graffiti in the bathroom, according to the evidence of my own senses, the relocation hadn't been complete. Some of them were still here, still in the ground beneath the pavement and the parking spaces, and the bathroom building, disturbed by construction but not removed, trapped under tons of asphalt and concrete. I should have gotten back in my truck right then, should have started the engine and driven away from this place regardless of how tired I was, or how much rest I still needed to log. But something kept me there, a morbid fascination combined with a strange sense of obligation, as if having noticed what this place really was, I was now responsible for bearing witness, for acknowledging the presence of those who remained beneath. The temperature was dropping as full night settled over the rest area, my breath forming visible clouds, and I noticed that frost was beginning to form on the grass around the picnic tables. Intricate patterns of ice crystals that seemed to spread from specific points, radiating outward like flowers blooming from invisible seeds. I counted 7 distinct centers where the frost was forming, 7 points in the picnic area where the ice grew thickest and most elaborate, and I realized I was looking at 7 graves, 7 sites where the relocation had missed someone, where bodies still lay under a few feet of dirt and grass, marked now only by frost patterns and the attention of a tired truck driver who'd made the mistake of noticing. I heard footsteps behind me, the crunch of gravel under heavy boots, and I turned to see a man approaching from the direction of that other semi-truck. He was older than me, 70s maybe, with white hair and the kind of weathered face that comes from a lifetime spent outdoors. He nodded at me as he drew closer, and I saw recognition in his eyes. The look of someone who knows he's found a kindred spirit, someone else who'd noticed what this place really was. "First time here?" he asked, his voice gravelly and rough, and when I nodded, he smiled without humor. "I come through every few months, always stop here, always pay my respects. Been doing it for 20 years now, ever since I figured out what they built this place on top of." He gestured toward the frost patterns. "There's more than 7, you know. Those are just the ones in the picnic area. There's at least a dozen under the parking lot, maybe more under the building. They did a rush job with the relocation, trying to save money, trying to meet the construction deadline. Dug up the ones with markers, the ones they could easily find, but left the rest. Paupers and strangers, mostly. People who died without family to tend their graves, the forgotten ones." He walked past me, toward the frost patterns, stopping at each one and standing for a moment in silence, his head bowed, lips moving in what might have been prayer or might have been something else. I watched him complete this circuit, honoring each of the 7 marked graves, and when he returned to where I stood, I could see tears on his weathered cheeks, reflecting the inadequate lighting. "My daughter," he said, answering a question I hadn't asked. "She's under the parking lot, space number 14. She died in 1965, just 3 years old. Pneumonia took her in 2 days. We buried her here because my wife's family had a plot, generations of them resting in Mercy Hill. When they told us they were moving the cemetery, we were assured she'd be relocated with the others, that we'd be able to visit her at the new place. But when I went to the new cemetery, her marker wasn't there, and when I asked about it, they told me there was no record of a grave for a child by her name." He pulled out a handkerchief, wiping his eyes, his hands shaking slightly. "I did research, filed complaints, even hired a lawyer, but the construction company and the state both denied any wrongdoing, insisted that all remains had been properly relocated. But I knew they were lying, knew that my little girl was still here, still under this ground they'd paved over. So I started coming here, stopping every time I drove this route, keeping her company the only way I could, making sure she wasn't completely forgotten." The story broke my heart in ways I hadn't expected. This old man's decades-long vigil for a daughter who'd been left behind, who'd been covered over and driven on by thousands of travelers who never knew she was there. "How do you know which space?" I asked quietly. "How do you know where she is?" He smiled again, that same joyless expression. "I feel her," he said simply. "When I stand in certain spots, I can feel her presence, like a warmth or a pressure, something that tells me I'm close to where she rests. Space 14 has that feeling stronger than anywhere else, so that's where I believe she is. Right there under the asphalt where the trucks park." He looked at me intently. "You felt something too, didn't you? That's why you're out here looking at frost patterns instead of sleeping in your cab. You're sensitive, like me, able to notice what most people drive right past." I admitted that yes, something had felt wrong about this place from the moment I'd arrived, that I'd noticed the patterns and the smells and the general wrongness that permeated the rest stop. He nodded, unsurprised. "The dead don't rest easy when they've been disrespected," he said, "when they've been forgotten or abandoned or built over like they never mattered. These souls here, they're restless, angry maybe, or just lonely, wanting someone to acknowledge that they existed, that they still exist in some form, even if their names have been lost and their markers removed." We stood together in the cold for a while longer, this grieving father and I, sharing the silence and the weight of knowledge we both carried. Eventually, he told me he needed to get back on the road, that he had a delivery to make in the morning. Before he left, he gave me a small stone, smooth and round, worn by years of handling. "For your pocket," he said. "Keep it with you, and when you stop at places like this, places where the dead have been disturbed or disrespected, leave it somewhere visible for a few minutes, an acknowledgement that you see them, that you remember they're there. Then pick it up and take it with you. It's a small thing, but small things matter to those who've been forgotten." I took the stone, feeling its weight and warmth in my palm, and I promised him I would honor his request, would carry this token and use it as he'd instructed. He drove away into the night, his trailer lights disappearing down the highway exit, and I was alone again in the rest stop built over Mercy Hills Cemetery, surrounded by the restless dead and the weight of their abandonment. I placed the stone on the ground, where one of the frost patterns was thickest, letting it sit there for several minutes while I stood in respectful silence, acknowledging the presence of whoever lay beneath. The air seemed to shift when I did this, becoming somehow lighter, as if the simple act of recognition had eased some burden that the dead had been carrying. I retrieved the stone, warm now, despite the cold night, and returned to my truck, the sense of oppression that had hung over the rest stop lifting slightly, though never entirely disappearing. I've stopped at that rest stop many times since that night, always leaving the stone for a few minutes, always paying my respects to those who remain beneath the pavement. And I've started noticing other places like it. Rest stops and parking lots and buildings constructed over forgotten cemeteries or disturbed graves. Places where the living have priority over the dead and where convenience takes precedence over respect. Each time I encounter one, I leave the stone. I stand in silence, and I acknowledge those who were left behind, who were covered over and driven on and forgotten by everyone except drivers like that old man and me, who are sensitive enough to notice and caring enough to remember. The stone sits in my pocket now, as I drive, a constant reminder of what lies beneath the surfaces we take for granted, of the forgotten people who rest uneasily under our highways and rest stops and the vast infrastructure of modern travel. It's a small burden to carry, this awareness, but it feels like an important one, a responsibility to the dead who have no one else to remember them, no one else to acknowledge that they existed and that they matter, even now, even under tons of asphalt and the wheels of trucks that pass overhead without ever knowing what they're driving on. Story 9. The Freight Manifest, written in blood. From Diesel Dan. Paperwork is the backbone of the trucking industry. The endless forms and manifests and bills of lading that track cargo from origin to destination, creating a paper trail that theoretically accounts for every item being transported across the country. Most of it is mundane, printed on standard forms or transmitted digitally, filled with codes and numbers and descriptions that reduce complex shipments to simple data points. But occasionally, you encounter paperwork that's unusual, documents that deviate from standard formats, or contain information that seems out of place or inappropriate. The Freight Manifest written in blood, though, was in a category entirely by itself, a document so profoundly wrong that I should have refused the load immediately, but greed and curiosity combined to override my better judgment, and I've spent every day since wondering what exactly I transported and whether some deliveries are better left undelivered. The job came through an independent broker I'd worked with a few times before, usually legitimate gigs that paid well for slightly irregular routes or time-sensitive deliveries. He called me on a Wednesday afternoon, his voice carrying an edge of nervous energy that I'd never heard from him before. "I've got something unusual," he said without preamble. "High pay, short haul, but the client has specific requirements and the paperwork is unconventional. Are you interested?" I should have asked for more details before agreeing, should have pressed him to explain what he meant by unconventional paperwork, but the pay he quoted was triple my normal rate for a one-day job, and I'd been having a slow month. I said yes, and he gave me the pickup location, a warehouse in the industrial district of Baltimore, and told me the manifest would be provided by the client when I arrived. The warehouse was exactly the kind of place you'd expect for a sketchy job. A converted factory building with broken windows and graffiti-covered walls, surrounded by other abandoned structures that spoke of better economic times long past. I pulled up to the loading dock, uncertain whether I'd even be able to find anyone to give me the cargo. But a door opened as I was climbing down from the cab, and a woman emerged, middle-aged and professionally dressed in a way that seemed completely out of place in this derelict setting. She carried a manila folder, and when she handed it to me, I noticed that her hands were gloved despite the warm weather, thin latex gloves like a doctor or lab technician might wear. "Your manifest," she said, her voice flat and emotionless. "Review it carefully. If you have any questions or concerns, voice them now, because once you accept the load, you're committed to completion." I opened the folder, expecting to see standard shipping documents, and instead found a single sheet of paper that stopped me cold. The manifest was handwritten in what appeared to be dark brown ink, except that ink doesn't have that particular texture, doesn't catch the light in quite that way, and doesn't carry that faint coppery smell that I recognized immediately as blood. Someone had written this manifest in actual blood, carefully forming each letter and number, documenting the cargo in fluid that had dried to a rusty brown but was unmistakably organic. The items listed were bizarre. Descriptions that made no sense for legitimate freight. 1 soul, partially damaged, contained in standard vessel, handle with extreme caution. 7 memories, extracted and preserved, requiring temperature-controlled transport. 3 dreams, recurring type, sealed in approved containers. The manifest went on like this, listing 12 items in total, none of them corresponding to any actual physical goods I could imagine, all of them described in language that suggested something far outside the normal realm of trucking. I looked up at the woman, holding the blood-written manifest, my hands shaking slightly. "What exactly am I transporting?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "These descriptions don't make sense. What are these items actually?" She smiled then, but it was a terrible smile, empty of warmth or humor. "They're exactly what the manifest says they are," she replied. "We deal in abstracts, in things that exist but aren't tangible in the traditional sense. Your truck will be loaded with 12 containers, each one holding one of the items listed. You don't need to understand what they are. You just need to transport them safely to the destination." She paused, her smile fading. "The blood is necessary, by the way. These particular items can only be properly documented using organic material. Standard ink or digital records don't register correctly with what we're shipping." Every instinct I had was screaming at me to walk away, to hand back the manifest and leave this place as fast as my truck could carry me. But the money was already being transferred to my account. I could see the notification on my phone, the promised payment deposited before I'd even accepted the load, and I was curious, I'll admit, morbidly fascinated by this glimpse into something completely outside my normal experience. So I nodded, against all wisdom, and I signed the manifest with the pen she provided, a pen that wrote in regular ink, creating a signature that looked mundane next to the blood-written inventory. The loading happened quickly, workers emerging from the warehouse with 12 identical containers, each one about the size of a small cooler, made of some dark metal I didn't recognize. They were secured in the trailer with excessive care, strapped down and cushioned as if they contained the most fragile items in the world, though when I watched them being moved, they seemed to weigh almost nothing, the workers carrying them easily without strain. The whole process took less than 30 minutes, and then I was being given the destination address, more coordinates than a proper street location, somewhere in rural Pennsylvania, where the map showed nothing but forest. I drove out of Baltimore as the sun was setting, the trailer behind me feeling simultaneously empty and heavy, the weight of those 12 containers somehow present, despite their apparent lack of physical mass. The blood-written manifest sat on the passenger seat, visible in my peripheral vision, a constant reminder of the fundamental wrongness of this job. I tried to convince myself that it was all theater, some elaborate client with eccentric requirements, that the containers held ordinary goods, and the whole blood manifest thing was just an affectation meant to impress or intimidate. But as night fell, and I drove deeper into Pennsylvania, leaving behind the major highways for progressively smaller roads, I started to experience things that couldn't be easily dismissed. The temperature in the cab began to fluctuate wildly despite the climate control being set to a constant level, swinging from uncomfortably hot to bone-chilling cold in minutes, as if something in the trailer was affecting the environment. I heard sounds that seemed to come from behind the wall, separating the cab from the cargo area. Not the normal rattling of freight, but something more organic. Sounds that might have been breathing, or might have been whispering. Voices too quiet to understand, but definitely present. The radio wouldn't work properly, picking up only static regardless of what station I tried. Though occasionally I'd catch fragments of broadcasts that seemed wrong. News reports about events that hadn't happened yet, or weather forecasts for places that didn't exist. And there were the lights, strange illuminations that appeared in the mirrors, glowing from inside the trailer even though there was no light source back there. Soft pulses of luminescence that cycled through colors that don't exist in nature, shades that hurt to look at directly. I checked the manifest again at a traffic light, unable to help myself, and I noticed something that hadn't been there before. New writing had appeared below the original inventory. More blood-written text that was still wet, glistening in the dim light from the dashboard. "The cargo dreams," it said. "The cargo remembers. The cargo wants to know who carries it." My hands were shaking so badly, I nearly dropped the paper, and I seriously considered pulling over and calling the broker, telling him I was abandoning the load and he could send someone else to complete the delivery. But I was too far along now, too close to the destination, and some perverse part of me needed to see this through, needed to understand what I'd gotten myself into, and what would happen when I reached whoever was waiting for these impossible items. The coordinates led me to a clearing in the forest, lit by lanterns rather than electric lights, where several people waited, wearing what looked like ceremonial robes. Though whether they were religious or something else entirely, I couldn't determine. They received me professionally, checking the manifest, and then moving to unload the containers with the same excessive care they'd been loaded with. I watched through the mirrors as they opened the trailer, and in the lantern light, I caught glimpses of what was in those containers, though my mind still can't quite process what I saw. Shapes that shifted and changed, colors that shouldn't exist, objects that occupied more or less space than their containers should have held. The leader of this group, an older man with intense eyes, came to my window and handed me a new folder, this one containing a completion receipt and a manifest marked "Delivered in full." Both documents were written in regular ink, mundane and ordinary, no trace of blood or organic material. "Thank you for your service," he said formally. "The items arrived safely, which is all that matters. You may forget what you've seen here, forget what you carried. Most drivers do, within a few days. The mind protects itself from information it can't process." He was right, in a way. The memories of that delivery have faded over time, becoming dreamlike and uncertain, details that slip away whenever I try to focus on them. But I still have the manifest, the blood-written document that I kept, despite knowing I should have returned it or destroyed it. I keep it locked in a safe, rarely looking at it, but aware of its presence, a tangible reminder that the world contains stranger things than regular freight, that some shipments move through the infrastructure of normal commerce, while remaining completely outside the bounds of what we understand as real. I never worked with that broker again, declined all subsequent offers, regardless of how much they paid, and I've become more careful about the loads I accept. More questioning of jobs that seem too lucrative or that come with unusual requirements. Because there are things moving across this country in trucks, just like mine, carried by drivers who either don't notice what they're hauling or who choose not to ask questions, and I don't want to be responsible for transporting anything like that again. Don't want to be the one who delivers souls and memories and dreams to people who collect such things for purposes I don't want to imagine. The manifest is still in my safe, and sometimes late at night I think about taking it out. about reading those blood-written words again and trying to remember exactly what I saw in those containers. But I never do, because the old man was right about the mind protecting itself, and there are some things we're better off forgetting. Some knowledge we're better off not having. Some deliveries we're better off pretending we never made. Story 10. The warehouse worker who vanished mid-sentence from Big Mike. Loading docks are typically chaotic places, full of activity and noise, and the constant movement of goods and people. Everyone focused on their specific tasks in the complex dance of logistics. You develop relationships with the regular workers at your frequent stops. The forklift operators and supervisors and dock managers who become familiar faces over years of repeated deliveries. They're usually reliable people, showing up day after day to do difficult physical work, and their consistency is part of what keeps the supply chain functioning. So when someone simply ceases to exist in the middle of a conversation, when they literally vanish between one word and the next, it shakes your understanding of reality in ways that don't easily resolve, and you're left questioning whether anything is as stable and reliable as it appears. I'd been making deliveries to a particular warehouse in Tennessee for nearly 10 years. A distribution center for a major retailer that handled everything from electronics to furniture. I knew the facility well, knew most of the workers by name, and had developed a particular friendship with a dock worker named Marcus, a guy about my age who shared my interest in classic cars and terrible action movies. We'd chat while my truck was being unloaded, catching up on each other's lives, comparing notes about vehicles, or discussing whatever recent film we'd watched. He was a constant presence at that facility, seemingly always working, always in good spirits, despite the demanding nature of his job. It was a Tuesday morning in late spring when I pulled into the loading dock, backing my rig up to Bay 17, where Marcus was already waiting, waving to guide me in with the practiced ease of someone who'd done this thousands of times. I climbed down from the cab, and we exchanged our usual greetings. Small talk about the weather and road conditions, while his crew prepared to unload my trailer. He was in the middle of telling me about a Chevelle he'd found at an estate sale, describing the condition of the engine, and whether he thought it was worth the asking price when it happened. He was mid-word, literally, saying, and the carburetor was completely shot, so I'd have to factor in, at least when he simply stopped existing. Not stopped talking, not paused or trailed off, but ceased to be there at all, vanishing between one syllable and the next, as if he'd been edited out of reality. One moment he was standing 3 feet in front of me, gesturing with his hands as he described the car, and the next moment there was just empty space, the air that had surrounded him now containing nothing but itself. I staggered backward, my mind refusing to process what I'd just witnessed, looking around frantically for some explanation. The other workers on the dock were continuing their tasks, loading and unloading trucks, operating forklifts, apparently completely unaware that anything unusual had occurred. I called out Marcus's name, but no one responded. No one looked up or showed any sign that they'd heard me or understood who I was asking about. I grabbed the nearest worker, a young guy I'd seen around but didn't know well, and demanded to know where Marcus had gone. The worker looked at me with confused concern, the kind of expression you give someone who's behaving erratically. Marcus, he repeated, as if trying to place the name. I don't know anyone named Marcus. Are you okay, man? You look kind of pale. I described Marcus, his appearance, and his role on the dock, his years of service at the facility. The young worker shook his head, insisting he'd been working there for 3 years and had never encountered anyone matching that description. Other workers gathered, drawn by the commotion, and I asked each of them about Marcus, desperate for someone to confirm that he'd existed, that I hadn't imagined a decade-long friendship with a man who'd just vanished into nothingness. No one remembered him. Not a single person at that warehouse, not the other dock workers, or the supervisors, or the office staff, had any memory of Marcus ever working there. They showed me employee records going back 15 years, and his name wasn't in them. They pulled up surveillance footage from earlier that morning, showing me backing into Bay 17, and in the video, I was guiding myself in. There was no one outside waving directions. I was doing it solo based on my own experience with the dock layout. I watched that footage 3 times, seeing myself climbing down from the cab and apparently having a conversation with empty air, gesturing and nodding as if responding to someone who wasn't there. In the video, I was alone, talking to myself, and then I was staggering backward and looking around frantically, my breakdown visible for anyone to see. The warehouse manager suggested I might need medical attention, might have experienced some kind of episode, and offered to call paramedics. I refused, insisting I was fine even though I clearly wasn't, and I left that warehouse in a state of profound confusion and dread. I drove 4 hours before I felt steady enough to think clearly, pulled over at a rest stop and tried to make sense of what had happened. Either I'd hallucinated an entire relationship spanning 10 years, creating detailed memories of conversations and interactions with a man who'd never existed, or reality itself was far more mutable and unstable than I'd ever imagined, capable of erasing people so completely that not even evidence of their existence remained. I looked through my phone, searching for any proof of Marcus, any text messages or photos or contact information that would confirm he'd been real. Nothing. My call logs and message history went back years, but there was no record of ever communicating with anyone named Marcus. I checked my social media, thinking maybe we'd connected there, but again found nothing. No friend requests or tags, or any digital footprint of our friendship. Desperate, I drove to the address where I remembered him living. A small house on the outskirts of town where he'd invited me once for a barbecue. The house was there, but it was occupied by a family who'd apparently lived there for 7 years, who'd never heard of Marcus and looked at me like I was a dangerous crazy person when I asked about him. I retreated to my truck, completely unmoored now, questioning everything I thought I knew about my own memory and perception. Over the following days, I tried to find any evidence that Marcus had existed. I called other drivers who frequented that warehouse, asking if they remembered him. None did. I reached out to the warehouse through official channels, requesting employment records, but was told there was no record of any employee by that name. I even hired a private investigator, gave him every detail I could remember about Marcus, but after 2 weeks of research he came back with nothing. Couldn't find any trace of a person matching that description, ever living or working in that area. The rational explanation was that I'd experienced some kind of elaborate false memory, perhaps the result of stress or a medical condition, that my brain had constructed this entire fictional relationship for reasons I couldn't understand. But the memories felt real, more real than many other events I could recall. I could remember specific conversations, could recall the sound of Marcus's laugh and the way he gestured when he was excited about something. I could remember details about his life, his family, his interests, information that seemed too specific and consistent to be fabricated. The other explanation, the one I didn't want to accept but couldn't entirely dismiss, was that something had erased Marcus from existence, had removed him so completely that reality itself had rewritten around his absence, adjusting records and memories and evidence to create a timeline in which he'd never been. And if that was possible, if people could simply be deleted from existence, then what did that mean for the rest of us? How stable was anyone's presence in the world? Could any of us vanish mid-sentence, be erased so thoroughly that even those who loved us would forget we'd ever been? I continued making deliveries to that warehouse in Tennessee, though it never felt the same. The dock where I'd spent so many hours talking with Marcus now, just an empty space full of strangers who'd never known him. Sometimes I'd catch myself starting to call out his name, expecting to see him emerge from the facility with that familiar wave and smile. And then I'd remember that according to everyone except me, he'd never existed at all. I've become more attentive since then, more careful about really seeing the people around me, trying to fix them in my memory, in case they too might vanish, might be erased from reality while I'm not looking. I take more photos now, document more interactions, create digital and physical evidence of the people I encounter, building a record that might persist even if the people themselves don't. It's probably futile. Probably can't protect against whatever force or phenomenon erased Marcus, but it makes me feel slightly less helpless, slightly more in control. And sometimes, late at night, when I'm alone in my truck, I'll say his name aloud, Marcus, keeping the memory alive through repetition, refusing to let him be completely forgotten, even if I'm the only one who remembers he existed. It's a small act of resistance against whatever erased him, an insistence that he was real and mattered, and shouldn't have been removed from existence so completely. I know it doesn't change anything, doesn't bring him back, or restore him to other people's memories, but it feels important nonetheless. This act of remembering, this refusal to accept that someone can simply cease to have ever been. Story 11. The Receiver Who Lived in the Woods from Highway Hank. Delivery addresses in the trucking industry usually point to recognizable locations. Businesses with loading docks, warehouses with proper facilities, residential addresses in developed areas. Occasionally you get sent to more remote locations, farms, or rural properties, where the access can be challenging. But even those deliveries follow certain logical patterns, destinations that make sense within the framework of how goods move through the economy. The receiver who lived in the woods, though, existed completely outside this framework, operating from a location so removed from normal infrastructure that I still don't understand how they conducted business, or why anyone would choose to receive commercial freight in such an impossible location. The delivery came through my dispatcher on a Friday afternoon, a rush order that needed to be completed over the weekend, which explained why they'd called me since I was one of the few drivers willing to work those hours. The cargo was oddly unspecified, just listed as specialty items with a weight that seemed low for the size of the shipment, and the delivery address was coordinates rather than a street location, pointing to somewhere deep in the Appalachian forest of West Virginia, miles from the nearest town. I should have asked more questions, should have gotten clarification about access roads and delivery procedures, but the pay was excellent, and I'd delivered 2 remote locations before, without major problems. I picked up the load from a climate-controlled facility in Virginia. 6 large crates that were surprisingly light despite their size, secured them in the trailer, and headed into the mountains as the afternoon sun began its descent toward the western horizon. The GPS led me off the interstate onto progressively smaller roads, 2-lane highways giving way to county routes that turned into barely maintained gravel tracks. The forest pressed close on both sides, old-growth trees forming a canopy that blocked out much of the remaining daylight, creating a perpetual twilight that made navigation difficult. I kept checking the GPS, making sure I was following the correct route, because nothing about this journey felt right, felt like it was leading to a legitimate delivery destination. Eventually, even the gravel road ended, terminating at a point where the GPS insisted I still had 5 miles to go. There was nothing ahead but forest, no path wide enough for a vehicle, certainly nothing that could accommodate a semi-truck with a full trailer. I parked and climbed down from the cab, studying the coordinates on my phone, confirming that yes, the delivery location was definitely deeper into these woods, in a place no truck could possibly reach. I called the dispatcher, explained the situation, and asked for clarification or alternate delivery instructions. After a long hold, during which I could hear muffled conversations in the background, he came back with information that made no sense. The receiver is aware of the access limitations, he told me. You're to unload the cargo at your current location and wait. The receiver will come to you. I questioned this, pointing out that I had 6 large crates that would be impossible to move manually through dense forest, that this couldn't be standard procedure for deliveries. The dispatcher's response was terse. Those are the client's instructions. Unload and wait. You'll be compensated for your time. Then he hung up before I could ask anything else, leaving me alone in the woods with a trailer full of cargo and instructions that violated every normal protocol. I opened the trailer and examined the crates more closely, considering the logistics of unloading them without proper equipment. They were sealed with heavy straps and marked with symbols I didn't recognize, abstract designs that might have been corporate logos, or might have been something else entirely. As I was studying them, I heard movement in the forest, branches snapping and leaves rustling, something large approaching through the undergrowth. A man emerged from the tree line, though calling him a man feels like it might not be entirely accurate. He was tall, over 6.5 feet, with proportions that seemed slightly off, limbs that were maybe too long, or joints that bent at angles that weren't quite right. He wore clothes that looked homemade, stitched together from various fabrics in a patchwork style, and his face, while human enough, had a quality that I can only describe as ancient, as if he'd lived far longer than any person should be able to. "You brought my delivery," he said, his voice surprisingly normal despite his unusual appearance. "Good. I've been waiting." He walked past me to the trailer, examining the crates through the open door, and nodded with satisfaction. "Yes, these are correct. I'll take them now." I started to explain that the crates were too heavy for one person to move, that we'd need equipment or multiple people to unload them safely. But he waved off my concerns and climbed into the trailer. He picked up the first crate, the one I'd estimated at 200 pounds at minimum, and lifted it effortlessly, carrying it like it weighed nothing at all. He walked with it into the forest, disappearing into the trees, and I stood there dumbfounded, watching the place where he'd vanished and wondering what exactly was happening. He returned within 5 minutes, which shouldn't have been possible given how far he'd have needed to go to reach any kind of structure or storage area, and he repeated the process with the second crate. Over the next half hour, he moved all 6 crates from my trailer into the forest, making the trip back and forth with mechanical efficiency, never showing any sign of effort or fatigue, despite the impossible weight he was carrying and the rough terrain he was traversing. On his final trip, I worked up the courage to ask him what exactly I'd delivered, what these specialty items were, and why they needed to be transported to such a remote location. He paused, considering the question, his eyes meeting mine with an intensity that made me want to look away, but couldn't. "Seeds," he said finally. "I'm planting a particular type of forest, one that doesn't grow naturally anymore, one that needs certain catalysts to establish itself. The items you delivered are those catalysts, materials that will help the forest remember what it used to be." I didn't understand what he meant, didn't know how to process the idea of planting a forest or helping trees remember anything. But before I could ask for clarification, he continued, "The world is changing, becoming something different from what it was, and certain things need to be preserved, need to be maintained in the old places, so they don't disappear entirely. I maintain this forest, keep it as it should be, and occasionally I need materials from the outside world to help with that maintenance." He handed me a receipt, printed on paper that felt wrong, too thick and textured, covered in writing that might have been English but used letters I'd never seen before. "Your delivery is complete," he said formally. "You can return to your normal routes now. And Hank," he used my name, though I'd never introduced myself. "Try not to remember this too clearly. The knowing can be burdensome, and you have enough weight to carry without adding my work to it." He walked back into the forest then, and this time he didn't return. I stood there for a long time, holding the strange receipt, listening to the sounds of the woods that seemed to be changing, growing louder and more complex, as if the trees themselves were waking up or becoming aware of my presence. Eventually, I climbed back into my truck and carefully backed down the gravel road, retracing my route out of the mountains. The receipt dissolved by the time I reached paved roads, the strange paper literally falling apart in my hands, turning to dust that blew away through my open window. I had no proof of the delivery, except the notification that payment had been transferred to my account. Triple the normal rate for a job that should have been straightforward, but had turned into something I still don't fully understand. I've never been sent back to those coordinates, never received another delivery for the receiver who lived in the woods. And I've tried, as he suggested, not to remember too clearly, to let the details fade and become dreamlike. But sometimes when I'm driving through forested areas, I catch myself looking into the tree line, searching for signs of whatever he was planting there, whatever type of forest he was trying to preserve or restore. And I wonder if the seeds he mentioned were literal or metaphorical, if I delivered actual physical items, or if I was just a small part of something larger and stranger, some work that's happening in the remote places where roads don't reach, and where things that shouldn't exist anymore are being carefully maintained by people who look almost but not quite human, who carry impossible weights and plant forests that remember what they used to be. Story 12. The cargo that whistled when I slept, from Ghost Gear Gary. Sleep deprivation is an occupational hazard in long-haul trucking, something every driver learns to manage through a combination of discipline, caffeine, and the ability to grab rest whenever opportunities present themselves. You become attuned to your body's signals, learning to recognize when fatigue is becoming dangerous, when you need to pull over and close your eyes for even just a few minutes to maintain safety on the road. But there are limits to how well you can sleep in a truck cab, limits imposed by noise and discomfort, and the general awareness that you're in a vehicle rather than a proper bed. So when something actively prevents sleep, when rest becomes impossible, despite exhaustion, it creates a special kind of torment, a deterioration of mental and physical state that can turn dangerous very quickly. The cargo that whistled when I slept created exactly that situation, a load that seemed designed to keep me awake, and by the end of that delivery run, I wasn't entirely certain whether I was still sane, or whether sleep deprivation had pushed me into some altered state, where reality and hallucination had become indistinguishable. The pickup was at a manufacturing facility in Ohio, one of those sprawling industrial complexes that produce components for larger assemblies, parts that ship to other facilities, where they'll be incorporated into finished products. The cargo manifest listed machine parts, precision-manufactured items requiring careful handling, but nothing particularly unusual or concerning. The loading went smoothly, workers securing the pallets in my trailer with standard procedures, and I pulled out in mid-afternoon, with the delivery deadline 3 days away. Plenty of time to make the trip to Arizona at a comfortable pace with proper rest breaks. The first night, I stopped at a truck stop in Missouri, finding a parking spot away from the diesel pumps and the all-night activity of the main building. I went through my usual evening routine, checking the load, securing the cab, setting my alarm, and settling into the sleeper berth with the expectation of 6 solid hours of rest. I was tired enough that sleep came quickly, that transition from wakefulness to unconsciousness happening smoothly, my mind beginning to drift into the first stages of actual rest. That's when the whistling started, a sound so sudden and loud that it yanked me back to consciousness, like someone had thrown ice water on my face. It wasn't a mechanical whistle, not the sound of wind through a gap or pressure escaping from a valve, but something organic and deliberate, a melody being whistled by what sounded like human lips, coming from somewhere in or near the trailer. The tune was unfamiliar, a wandering series of notes that never quite resolved into anything recognizable, just meandering up and down scales in patterns that felt almost but not quite musical. I sat up in the sleeper berth, my heart racing, listening intently and trying to locate the source of the sound. It was definitely coming from the trailer, I could tell that much, echoing slightly in the enclosed space in a way that made pinpointing its exact origin difficult. My first thought was that someone had stowed away, that I had an unauthorized passenger hiding among the cargo. But that seemed unlikely, given how thoroughly the load had been secured and how closely I'd watched the loading process. I climbed out of the sleeper and into the cab, grabbing my flashlight, and went around to open the trailer doors. The whistling stopped the moment I touched the door handles, cutting off mid-note, and when I swung them open and shone my light inside, everything looked exactly as it should, the pallets still properly secured. No sign of any person or animal or anything else that could have been making that sound. I climbed inside, walking between the pallets, checking behind and under them, but found nothing unusual, just carefully packaged machine parts, sitting exactly where they'd been loaded hours earlier. I convinced myself I'd been dreaming, that the whistle had been part of a particularly vivid dream state, rather than an actual sound, and I closed up the trailer and returned to the sleeper berth. But the moment I started to drift off again, the whistling resumed, the same wandering melody, the same organic quality that suggested a conscious mind producing the sound deliberately. This time I was certain I was awake, could feel the mattress beneath me, and see the familiar interior of the cab in the dim light from the parking lot. And the whistle was absolutely real, absolutely coming from the trailer. I gave up on sleep and started driving, figuring I could put in a few more hours and then try to rest later. Maybe the motion of the truck would somehow prevent whatever was causing the whistle. But I was wrong, because an hour down the highway, exhaustion pulling at my eyelids, I found myself starting to micro-sleep. Those dangerous moments where consciousness lapses for just a second or two, and every time I began to slip into one of those micro-sleeps, the whistling would start immediately, jolting me back to alertness, as if something was monitoring my brain state and deliberately preventing any loss of consciousness. By dawn, I was a wreck, exhausted beyond anything I'd experienced before, my eyes burning and my thoughts becoming fuzzy and disconnected. I pulled over at a rest area and tried again to sleep, determined to push through whatever was causing the whistling, to ignore it and let my body's desperate need for rest override the disturbance. But it was impossible. The sound was too loud, too insistent, and it seemed to know exactly when I was on the edge of sleep, starting up at the precise moment when unconsciousness was about to claim me. I called the shipping company, explained that something in the cargo was making noise, asked if there was any explanation or if I should inspect the items more thoroughly. The person I spoke with was confused, insisting that the machine parts were inert, non-powered components that couldn't possibly generate sound. They suggested I might be experiencing mechanical issues with the truck itself, maybe air leaks or other problems that were creating whistling sounds. But I knew it wasn't the truck, knew with absolute certainty that the sound was coming from the cargo, and that it was specifically triggered by my attempts to sleep. The second night was worse than the first, my exhaustion so profound that I was seeing things at the edges of my vision, shadows that moved when I looked away, shapes that resolved into nothing when I focused on them. I tried sleeping pills, over-the-counter medication that should have knocked me out despite any disturbance. But the whistling defeated even pharmaceutical intervention, penetrating whatever chemical fog the pills created and dragging me back to consciousness every single time I approached actual sleep. I started to notice patterns in the whistle, rhythms that repeated with slight variations, and in my sleep-deprived state, I began to imagine that it was trying to communicate something, that the wandering melody contained information if I could just decode it. I found myself humming along with it during the third day of driving, matching the notes, trying to anticipate where the tune would go next, my exhausted mind finding weird comfort in the sound that was tormenting me. By the third night, I was hallucinating regularly, having conversations with people who weren't there, seeing landscapes outside my windows that couldn't exist in Missouri or Kansas or wherever I actually was. The line between reality and dream had collapsed completely, and I was operating in some hybrid state where I was technically awake but experiencing all the disconnection and illogic of deep dreams. The whistling had become constant now, no longer waiting for me to try sleeping but just playing continuously, and I realized that it had achieved its purpose, had kept me awake for so long that I'd moved beyond tiredness into some other condition entirely. I don't remember much of the actual delivery. My memory of arriving in Arizona fragmented and uncertain. Images of unloading and paperwork mixed with impossibilities, like talking to my younger self or seeing the cargo pallets floating away into a purple sky. The shipping company later told me I'd completed the delivery successfully, that there had been no issues with the cargo or the truck, that I'd been professional and competent throughout the interaction, but I have no clear recollection of it. Just gaps and fragments that might be memories or might be fabrications my exhausted brain created to fill in the blanks. What I do remember clearly is the moment after the trailer was emptied, when I finally had no cargo at all, and I immediately fell into the deepest sleep of my life, collapsing in the cab at the delivery facility and sleeping for 14 straight hours, without moving or dreaming or experiencing anything at all. Just pure black unconsciousness that my body desperately needed. When I finally woke, I felt like I'd returned from somewhere very far away, someplace outside normal experience, where the rules of consciousness and sleep didn't apply in familiar ways. I never figured out what was actually in those machine parts. Never learned why they triggered that whistling, or how they monitored my sleep state. The shipping company denied any knowledge of unusual properties in the cargo, and the receiving facility reported that the items were exactly as specified, standard manufactured components with no unusual characteristics. But I know what I experienced, know that something in that load was actively preventing sleep, and I've wondered since whether it was intentional, whether I was carrying something that needed to be transported by someone in an altered state, someone who'd been kept awake until the boundaries of reality became permeable. I've become more careful about what loads I accept, paying attention to any cargo that seems unusually light or that comes with vague descriptions. And I've never again experienced anything quite like those 3 days of enforced wakefulness. Though sometimes when I'm trying to sleep at rest stops, I'll hear whistling in the distance and my heart will race. Terrified that it's starting again, that I've unknowingly accepted another load that will keep me awake and push me back into that nightmare state where sleep becomes impossible and reality becomes negotiable. The human mind needs sleep to function properly, needs those periods of unconsciousness to process and repair and maintain sanity. Take that away, prevent it forcibly and completely, and what's left isn't quite human anymore, isn't quite operating in the same world as everyone else. And I know that now, know it from experience. Know what happens when you spend too long in the spaces between waking and sleeping, where whistling cargo can keep you suspended and change you in ways that don't entirely reverse even after you finally get to rest. Story 13. The bridge that collapsed behind me from Rusty Joe. Infrastructure failure is one of those background fears that drivers carry with them, an awareness that the roads and bridges we rely on are aging and sometimes inadequately maintained, that any trip could potentially involve a catastrophic structural collapse. But these failures, when they occur, happen according to predictable patterns, stress and decay reaching critical points that engineers can usually identify and address before disaster strikes. What happened on that bridge in Kentucky, though, didn't follow any predictable pattern, didn't make sense according to any engineering principles I understand, and I'm still not certain whether I survived a genuine infrastructure failure or something far stranger, something that chose to spare me while taking everything that came after. The bridge spanned a river valley in eastern Kentucky, one of those older structures built in the 60s or 70s, a concrete arch that had been carrying traffic for decades without major incident. I'd crossed it dozens of times over my years of driving, never giving it much thought beyond the usual awareness of being above water, that mild discomfort that comes from knowing you're suspended over a drop. It was a routine crossing on a routine run, hauling construction supplies from Tennessee to Ohio, the kind of driving I could do half asleep because I'd done it so many times before. It was early morning, the sun just beginning to rise and burn off the mist that hung over the river, visibility gradually improving as I approached the bridge. Traffic was light, just a few other vehicles scattered across the span, the usual mix of commercial and passenger vehicles all moving at the posted speed. I was in the right lane, maintaining pace with traffic, my mind occupied with thoughts about breakfast and how far I could get before needing my next rest break. Mundane considerations that filled the mental space of long-distance driving. I was about 3/4 across the bridge when I felt it. A vibration that wasn't quite right. A resonance in the steering wheel and the cab that suggested something wrong with the road surface or the truck itself. I immediately started mentally checking systems. Running through the diagnostic process, drivers learn to identify mechanical problems before they become serious. But before I could isolate the issue, the vibration intensified dramatically, becoming a shaking so violent that I struggled to maintain control of the truck, the steering wheel jerking in my hands, and the whole rig threatening to fit. I looked in the mirrors, an instinctive check, to see if other vehicles were experiencing similar problems, and what I saw made no sense, couldn't be real, violated everything I understood about how the world worked. The bridge behind me was collapsing, not slowly, or in sections, but all at once. the entire span disintegrating as if it had never been solid. Concrete and steel simply ceasing to exist and dropping everything it had been supporting into the river valley below. I saw vehicles falling, cars and trucks and a school bus tilting and then plunging into the void where the bridge had been, and I was screaming, stomping the accelerator and trying to outrun the collapse that was spreading toward me, eating the bridge from behind and gaining on my truck with impossible speed. The shaking was tremendous now, the whole remaining section of bridge bucking and heaving, and I could hear the sound of structural failure, a groaning, tearing noise that I'd heard before in construction site accidents, but never on this scale, never with this totality. The gap where the bridge used to be was right behind my trailer now, maybe 20 feet back, and I could see it in the mirrors, an expanding nothingness pursuing me, and I knew with complete certainty that I wasn't going to make it, that the collapse would reach me before I could get to solid ground. But then I was across, my truck flying off the end of the bridge and onto the approach road, the rear wheels touching pavement just as the section I'd been on ceased to exist, and I was still moving, still accelerating away from catastrophe, glancing in the mirrors to see the entire bridge gone, just vanished, leaving nothing but empty air where a moment before there had been a structure that had stood for half a century. I pulled over a quarter-mile past the bridge, my hand shaking so badly I could barely operate the controls, my breathing coming in gasps that bordered on hyperventilation. I climbed down from the cab on legs that barely supported me and looked back toward where the bridge should have been, and saw only the river valley, the water flowing peacefully far below, the opposite bank visible in the morning light. There was no debris, no dust cloud from the collapse, no sign that anything had fallen into the water or onto the banks. I grabbed my phone and called 911, reporting the bridge collapse, describing what I'd witnessed, trying to convey the urgency and scale of the disaster. The dispatcher listened patiently, and then, in a tone that suggested she was humoring someone unstable, told me that there was no bridge at that location, that the river valley I was describing was crossed by a ferry service 3 miles south, but had never had a bridge spanning it. She suggested I might be confused about my location, might have just crossed a different bridge and gotten disoriented. I insisted I knew where I was, gave her specific mile markers and road numbers, described the bridge in detail. She put me on hold, presumably to check records or consult with others, and when she came back, her tone had changed, become more concerned, but in a different way, as if she was now worried about my mental state rather than about any infrastructure failure. She confirmed that there was no bridge at the location I'd specified, had never been a bridge there according to Highway Department records, and would I like her to send emergency medical services to my location to check if I was injured or experiencing medical distress. I hung up, disturbed now, in a different way, and drove back toward where the bridge should have been, following the road as it curved toward the river valley. The approach road I'd just exited terminated in a dead end, barricades and signs indicating that the road had been closed for years, that there was no through traffic to the other side. I parked and walked to the edge, looking down at the river and then across to where I'd come from, and saw no evidence of any bridge, no support pillars or abutments, no scars on the landscape, suggesting anything had ever connected these 2 points. But I'd crossed it, I knew I had, could remember every detail of that transit. The feel of the bridge surface under my tires, the view of the water through the guardrails, the way the sun was hitting the mist, and I'd seen it collapse, had watched it fall away behind me, taking other vehicles and people with it, into the void. Those events had happened, I was certain, but apparently they'd happened in a version of reality that no longer existed or had never existed in the first place. I called my dispatcher, told him I'd had to detour due to a closed road, didn't mention the bridge or the collapse because I was beginning to understand that doing so would only make people question my stability. He was confused about my location, said I should have been further north by now if I'd been following my assigned route. But he gave me new directions that would get me back on track, and I spent the rest of the day driving in a daze, trying to reconcile what I'd experienced with what everyone else seemed to believe was true. Over the following weeks, I did research, looking for any historical information about a bridge at that location. I found references in very old documents, mentions of a bridge project proposed in the 60s that was apparently never completed, engineering studies and budget discussions, but no record of actual construction. There were a few newspaper articles from the 70s mentioning a bridge that locals swore existed, but that the highway department denied any knowledge of stories that read like local legends or collective false memories, people insisting they'd crossed a bridge that officially had never been built. And there were accident reports. I found those too, scattered across several decades. Individual incidents where drivers claimed to have witnessed or barely escaped from a bridge collapse at that exact location. Each report dismissed as confusion or hallucination or some other explanation that didn't require accepting that a non-existent bridge was periodically collapsing. The dates of these reports followed no pattern I could discern, sometimes years apart, sometimes multiple incidents in a single month, as if the bridge existed intermittently, appearing and failing and taking victims before vanishing again into whatever unreality spawned it. I've crossed that location many times since, always during daylight, always watching carefully to see if the bridge appears. Mostly the road just terminates at the barrier, the valley unbridged and empty, exactly as official records say it should be. But twice, maybe 3 times, I've seen it there as I approach, solid and real, and open to traffic, and both times I've turned around, taken the long detour south to the ferry crossing, refusing to trust that structure, even though part of me wonders if it's always been there, if the times I don't see it are the hallucinations, rather than the times I do, because I remember the collapse too vividly. Remember the vehicles falling and the sound of structural failure. Remember outrunning disaster by mere feet, and then discovering that the disaster had never officially happened. And I wonder about the other drivers in those vehicles I saw falling, whether they survived in some other version of events, whether they're still crossing that bridge in a reality adjacent to ours, or whether they simply ceased to exist when the bridge vanished, erased from the world as thoroughly as the structure itself, leaving no bodies or wreckage or even memories beyond my own uncertain recollection of having seen them fall into a void that officially never opened beneath them. Story 14. The dispatcher who spoke in my dead wife's voice from Silent Steve. Communication is the backbone of commercial trucking, the constant flow of information between drivers and dispatchers that keeps goods moving efficiently across the country. Most dispatchers are voices without faces, people you speak with regularly but may never meet in person. Relationships built entirely through phone calls and radio transmissions, personalities reduced to vocal characteristics and communication styles. You learn to recognize your dispatcher's voice, the particular rhythms and inflections that identify them, and that voice becomes a comforting constant in the isolation of the road, a connection to the larger organization that gives your solo driving purpose and direction. So when that voice changes, when it becomes something it shouldn't be, when your dispatcher suddenly speaks with the voice of someone who died years ago, it creates a disorientation that goes beyond confusion, that strikes at fundamental questions about reality and whether the dead ever truly leave us, or whether they linger in the systems and technologies that structure our lives, waiting for opportunities to reach back across the barrier between living and gone. My wife Sarah died 3 years before this incident. Cancer that came fast and took her faster, 6 months from diagnosis to funeral, leaving me alone in a house suddenly too large and in a life I no longer knew how to navigate. Driving had been my escape, my way of avoiding the empty spaces she used to fill, and I threw myself into long-haul work with an intensity that concerned my friends and family, but that kept me functional, kept me moving forward instead of collapsing under the weight of grief. Her voice was something I'd preserved in recordings, old voicemails and videos I couldn't bring myself to delete, audio files I'd listened to late at night, when the loneliness became overwhelming, reminding myself of how she laughed and spoke and existed in the world. I knew her voice better than any other sound, could identify it instantly, regardless of context or audio quality, knew every inflection and breath pattern and verbal quirk that made her communication unique. So when my dispatcher called me on a Tuesday morning with my next assignment and spoke with Sarah's voice, I knew immediately that something impossible was happening. That I was either experiencing a psychological break, or that reality had become far stranger than I'd believed possible. "Good morning, Steve," the voice said, and it was her, unmistakably her. The same warm tone she'd used every morning of our marriage, the same slight hoarseness she'd had before her first coffee, the same way of pronouncing my name with a softness that suggested affection rather than formality. "I have a new assignment for you. A pickup in Memphis with delivery to Seattle. Standard load, 3-day window. Are you available?" I couldn't speak, couldn't process what I was hearing, my throat closing and my eyes burning with sudden tears. This had to be a mistake, some bizarre coincidence of vocal similarity. A new dispatcher who happened to sound like Sarah, though the odds of that were astronomical. The match too perfect to be random chance. I managed to croak out a question. "Who is this?" My voice breaking on the words. There was a pause on the other end of the line, and I heard her breathe. That particular breath she'd take before saying something difficult or important. "It's dispatch, Steve. Sarah from dispatch. I'm calling about your next load. Are you feeling all right? You sound distressed." Sarah from dispatch. She'd never worked in dispatching, had been a teacher, had spent her life in classrooms with children, had never had any connection to the trucking industry beyond being married to me. And yet here was someone claiming to be her, using her voice, knowing my name, calling from my company's dispatch number. I looked at my phone screen, confirming the caller ID showed my actual dispatcher's line, not a spoofed number or unfamiliar contact. "I am fine," I said, though I clearly wasn't. "Can you transfer me to Jim?" My regular dispatcher. Jim was the man I'd been working with for 5 years, a gruff, efficient communicator who'd seen me through the worst of my grief and never made me talk about feelings while insuring. I kept getting assignments. "I am your regular dispatcher, Steve," the voice said, still Sarah's voice, still impossible. "I've been dispatching for you for 3 years now, ever since you came back to work." After she paused, and I heard sadness in that pause, recognition of something difficult. "After your leave. Don't you remember? We've talked hundreds of times." My memory contradicted this completely, held no recollection of ever speaking with anyone but Jim in dispatch. But the voice continued with specific details, recounting assignments I definitely remembered, trips I'd taken, describing interactions we'd supposedly had during those calls, and the details were accurate, things Jim would have known, information from my actual work history, but delivered in Sarah's voice, with Sarah's speech patterns, with an intimacy that Jim had never displayed. I accepted the assignment because I didn't know what else to do, wrote down the details she provided, and ended the call as quickly as possible, my hands shaking and my mind racing. I immediately called dispatch again, got the same number, and Sarah's voice answered, professional and pleasant, asking how she could help me. I hung up and tried calling from a different phone, a payphone at the truck stop, and got the same result. That impossible familiar voice coming through the line, claiming to be my dispatcher, acting as if our ongoing working relationship was completely normal. I drove to Memphis in a state of profound confusion, trying to rationalize what was happening, cycling through explanations that became progressively more desperate. Maybe I'd developed some kind of auditory processing disorder that made all female voices sound like Sarah's. Maybe. This was an elaborate, cruel prank, someone using audio samples to replicate her voice. Maybe I'd finally had the psychological break everyone had been expecting, my grief manifesting as hallucinations that imposed my dead wife's voice onto the present. But the voice persisted through every interaction with dispatch. Checking in when I reached Memphis, confirming the pickup, providing updates on traffic conditions, all delivered in Sarah's exact vocal fingerprint, and other people heard it too. I confirmed that, asking other drivers if my dispatcher sounded unusual, and they said no, said she sounded like a perfectly normal middle-aged woman with a pleasant voice, nothing strange or notable, which meant they were hearing something different than I was, or that the voice was somehow calibrating itself to each listener, giving everyone what they expected to hear, except me. giving me something I couldn't possibly expect and didn't want. The conversations became more personal as the trip progressed. The dispatcher, who sounded like Sarah, asking about how I was feeling, whether I was taking care of myself, whether I'd been to visit her grave recently. The questions felt like things Sarah would ask, demonstrated knowledge of our relationship and my habits that a dispatcher shouldn't have, and I found myself responding honestly, talking to this voice about loneliness and grief and guilt, having conversations I'd never had with my actual dispatcher, but that I'd wanted to have with Sarah, things left unsaid when she died that I desperately wished I could tell her. By the second day, I was having full conversations with her during my driving, using the hands-free system to talk for hours about nothing and everything. The dispatch calls becoming extended therapy sessions where I processed feelings I'd been suppressing for years, and the voice responded like Sarah would have, with compassion and insight and occasional humor, reminding me that I needed to keep living, that grief was natural but shouldn't become my entire existence, that she would want me to be happy even though she was gone. I started to question whether this was actually happening or whether I'd created an elaborate coping mechanism, whether my mind had finally found a way to process Sarah's death by projecting her voice onto my work communications, giving myself permission to grieve and heal by disguising therapy as dispatch calls. The distinction between real and imaginary became less important than the fact that these conversations were helping, that I was feeling lighter, more capable, more willing to engage with life beyond just driving and avoiding. On the third day, approaching Seattle with the delivery, the voice called one final time. "Steve," she said, and I could hear tears in it now, emotion that Sarah had shown only in our most intimate moments. "I need you to know something. I'm not really dispatch, and I'm not really Sarah, not in the way you understand either of those things. I'm something else, something that exists in the systems and signals that connect people. And I've been using her voice because it was the only way you'd listen, the only way you'd let yourself feel what you needed to feel." I pulled over, unable to drive while hearing this, tears streaming down my face as the voice continued. "She's gone, Steve. She's really gone, and she can't come back, and pretending otherwise isn't helping you anymore. You've done the grief work now. You've said the things you needed to say, and it's time to let her voice go, to stop hearing her in places she isn't, to start living in the present instead of the past." "I don't want to," I said, my voice breaking completely. "I don't want to stop hearing her, don't want to lose this last connection." "You're not losing her," the voice said gently. "She's part of you, will always be part of you, and you don't need me to speak with her voice for that to be true. You can remember her and honor her and still move forward, still be open to new connections and experiences. That's what she'd want, Steve. That's what I'm here to tell you." Using her voice one last time so you'll really hear it. The call ended, and when I tried to call dispatch again, I got Jim, my regular dispatcher's familiar gruff voice, asking if I needed anything. He had no knowledge of anyone named Sarah in dispatch, confirmed that he'd been my only dispatcher for years, had no explanation for why I might have been hearing a different voice. The logs showed all my recent calls had been with him, standard brief communications about loads and schedules, nothing like the extended conversations I remembered. I completed the delivery in Seattle and drove home, not to my next assignment, but to my actual home, that house I'd been avoiding, and I spent a week there cleaning out Sarah's belongings, finally doing the work of moving forward that I'd been postponing. And I went to her grave and talked to her, really talked, without needing her to respond, without needing to hear her voice coming through phone lines or radio systems, just speaking my truth to the earth, where she rested, and then walking away feeling lighter than I had in years. I still drive long haul, still work with Jim in dispatch, and his voice is just a voice now, functional and professional, without any overlay of impossible familiarity. And sometimes I wonder what that other voice really was, whether I'd hallucinated it entirely, or whether something genuinely strange had happened. Some entity or system or manifestation of my own grief that had worn Sarah's voice to help me heal. But ultimately it doesn't matter, because whatever it was, it gave me what I needed. gave me permission to grieve fully, and then let go, to remember my wife without being haunted by her, to hear her voice in memory without needing to hear it in reality, and to finally accept that some connections, no matter how deep, must eventually end, so that new ones can begin. Story 15. The truck stop where every radio played screams from Diesel Dave. Truck stops serve as crucial infrastructure for long-haul drivers, providing fuel and food and rest in locations scattered across the highway system. Temporary havens where the isolated work of driving intersects with commercial services and human interaction. Most truck stops achieve a kind of generic consistency, chains that replicate the same layout and amenities across hundreds of locations, creating familiarity that drivers rely on when far from home. You develop preferences and routines, favorite stops where the coffee is better, where the parking is easier, and you learn to read the subtle signs that indicate whether a facility is well maintained and safe, or whether it's declining into disrepair and should be avoided. But sometimes you encounter truck stops that defy categorization, places that seem normal from the outside, but that harbor wrongness so profound it permeates every aspect of the facility, and the truck stop where every radio played screams was exactly that kind of place. A location that I only stopped at once but that I think about often. What I think about I only stick about, I think it I think about if it's still watering hindering in, and is still operating in that is still oppy up at one I'm pong it mom and all it I'm in out the but it would it all it will that it I know and will it our that to our to develop that by to better what the top but do it you have to do it still broadcasting its terrible signal to drivers who make the mistake of tuning in. I found it on a night drive through Iowa, somewhere between Des Moines and Omaha. Following a route I'd driven dozens of times before, but taking an exit I didn't remember seeing on previous trips. Drawn by the familiar signs advertising fuel and food, and the basic amenities every driver needs. The facility looked standard from the highway approach. The typical layout of pumps and parking, and a main building with the telltale architecture of a national chain. Nothing immediately unusual or concerning about it. I pulled in, needing diesel and coffee. The usual combination that keeps trucks and drivers running through the night hours. And I backed into a pump island with the practiced ease of thousands of previous refueling stops. The parking lot was moderately full, other trucks scattered throughout the spaces, their running lights and idling engines, creating the familiar landscape of overnight truck stops across America. Nothing seemed wrong or off, no visible signs of problems, just another anonymous facility serving anonymous drivers in the great machinery of commercial freight. I started fueling, and noticed that the usual background noise of the truck stop was absent. The normal sounds of other drivers talking, or engines revving, or distant traffic from the highway, replaced by a kind of pressing silence that seemed unnatural for such a busy location. The other trucks were running. I could see their exhaust, but I couldn't hear them. Couldn't hear anything except the click of the fuel pump and the sound of my own breathing, as if someone had turned down the volume on everything except the immediate sounds I was producing myself. The fueling completed, and I headed into the main building, looking for the coffee station and maybe a snack to keep my energy up for the remaining hours of driving. The interior was well lit and clean, stocked with the usual selection of drinks and packaged foods and trucker supplies. But it was empty of people. No cashier behind the counter, and no other customers browsing the aisles. Despite the number of trucks outside suggesting there should have been multiple drivers inside taking breaks, I called out, asking if anyone was working, and my voice sounded flat and dead in the space. Not echoing the way it should in the large room, but being absorbed by something I couldn't see or identify. I grabbed a coffee from the self-serve station and left money on the counter, following the honor system since there was no one to pay directly, and I was turning to leave when I noticed the radio behind the counter was on, its display lit, and it was tuned to a station that was playing something that made my blood run cold. Screaming. Pure human screaming. Not music, or talk radio, or any normal broadcast content. Just endless screaming. Multiple voices overlapping in expressions of terror, or agony, or both. Rising and falling in pitch, but never stopping, never giving way to silence or speech or any other sound. I stared at the radio, unable to look away, and I realized that the screaming had layers, that beneath the obvious vocal terror, there were other sounds, whispers and words, and things that might have been messages if I could just focus on them. Information encoded in the screaming that my brain was trying to decode, despite every instinct telling me to stop listening, to leave immediately. I backed toward the door, my coffee forgotten on the counter, and as I moved through the building, I noticed that every radio I passed was on. Every device tuned to that same station playing that same endless screaming. The radios in the automotive section, the one near the bathroom entrance, the small portable units for sale on the merchandise shelves. All of them broadcasting the same terrible signal, all of them synchronized perfectly, so that the screaming never created echoes or conflicts, but formed a unified chorus of suffering that filled the entire facility. Outside, I heard it coming from the trucks as well. Every cab radio, apparently tuned to the same station. The screaming leaking through closed windows and doors, creating a soundscape of terror across the entire truck stop. And now, I could see the other drivers. They were in their cabs. I could make out shapes through the windows, but they were motionless, heads bowed or tilted back, apparently listening to that screaming broadcast, apparently unable or unwilling to turn it off or escape from it. I ran to my truck, my heart pounding, and climbed into the cab with the intention of starting the engine and leaving immediately. But my radio was on too. I'd left it on when I'd parked, and it was also playing the screaming. That same station, somehow overriding whatever frequency I'd been tuned to before, and the sound was louder in the enclosed cab, impossibly loud, like the speakers were amplifying beyond their capacity, and I could feel it now, not just hear it, vibrations that passed through my body and seemed to synchronize with my heartbeat. I lunged for the radio controls, trying to turn it off, but the knobs didn't respond, didn't change the volume or switch it off, the screaming continuing, regardless of my efforts. I tried pulling fuses, disconnecting the power, anything to silence it, and finally, I just grabbed a screwdriver from my toolkit and smashed the radio itself, breaking the display and the speaker grill, physically destroying the device to stop the sound. Silence fell, sudden and complete, and in that silence I could think clearly again, could feel the panic receding slightly. I started the engine and pulled out of the parking spot, driving between the rows of other trucks toward the exit, and as I passed each one, I could see the drivers inside, still motionless, still listening to whatever was coming through their radios, trapped or enthralled or transformed by that broadcast into something that wasn't quite human anymore, just receptacles for screaming, vessels filled with the transmitted agony of unknown sources. I made it to the highway and drove for 2 hours straight, before I felt safe enough to stop again. Finding a different truck stop, a familiar chain location, where everything was blessedly normal, where the radios played ordinary stations, and other drivers were awake and functional. I asked about the previous stop, tried to describe its location, but no one knew what I was talking about. Couldn't identify any truck stop in that area matching my description, and when I checked my GPS history, there was no record of that exit or that location, just a straight line showing my route without any deviation or stop. I reported the incident to my company, told them about a truck stop with some kind of broadcast problem. Though I downplayed the details, made it sound like interference rather than something deliberately wrong. They said they'd look into it, but I never heard anything further, and when I drove that route again weeks later, I couldn't find the exit, couldn't locate any truck stop where I remembered it being. Just uninterrupted highway through empty countryside without services for miles in either direction. But I replaced my radio. Had to, after smashing the old one. And sometimes late at night, when I'm scanning stations, I'll hear fragments of that screaming, just brief moments before I changed the frequency, but enough to remind me that it's still broadcasting somewhere, still creating that terrible signal, still waiting for drivers to tune in and become trapped in that listening, that paralyzed reception of transmitted suffering. And I'm more careful now about where I stop, more attentive to the subtle wrongness that can indicate a place that only appears to be normal, that uses the familiar infrastructure of truck stops to draw in drivers and transform them into something else, something that just sits and listens and screams along with the radio until someone or something finally turns them off for good. Story 16. The town that smelled like burnt diesel from Mudflap Mike. Some towns exist primarily to serve the highway. Communities that grew up around truck stops and gas stations and cheap motels. Places where the economy depends entirely on travelers passing through rather than on any local industry or agriculture. These towns have a transient quality, a sense that they're not quite real permanent settlements, but rather way stations, temporary clusters of services that could disappear if the highway were ever rerouted. Most of them are forgettable, indistinguishable collections of the same chain restaurants and budget accommodations, places you pass through without forming any lasting impression or memory. But there was one town in West Texas, a small cluster of buildings barely qualifying as a community, that I've never been able to forget, not because of anything I saw there, but because of what I smelled, an odor so pervasive and wrong that it seemed to define the entire place, and because of what I eventually learned about why that smell existed, and what it meant for the people who lived there permanently, rather than just passing through like me. The town didn't have a name that I could find on any map, or if it did, the name wasn't marked on the standard adresses and GPS systems that drivers rely on. It appeared as I was driving through one of those long empty stretches of West Texas highway, where civilization seems to have given up entirely, where the landscape is just scrub brush and distant mesas, and the occasional windmill marking someone's attempt at ranching in inhospitable terrain. I'd been driving for hours without seeing any services, my fuel gauge dropping into the concerning range, when the town appeared almost suddenly, a collection of buildings emerging from the heat shimmer, like a mirage that had decided to become temporarily solid. There was a gas station, essential and welcome given my fuel situation, and a few other structures that might have been homes or might have been abandoned businesses. It was hard to tell from the highway. I pulled into the gas station, noting that it was an independent operation rather than a national chain, one of those increasingly rare places that hadn't been absorbed into corporate uniformity. The pumps were old, mechanical rather than digital, the kind that required the attendant to reset them manually, and I had to go inside to prepay before I could fuel. No option for paying at the pump. That's when I first noticed the smell, the moment I opened my truck door and stepped out into the Texas heat. It was diesel, unmistakably diesel, that sharp petroleum odor that every trucker knows intimately. But there was something wrong with it, something burnt and acrid underneath the familiar scent, as if someone had been burning diesel fuel rather than using it properly, creating a smell that was recognizable but also deeply unpleasant, carrying associations of waste and destruction rather than the productive burning that happens in engines. The smell was everywhere, permeating the air so thoroughly that breathing felt like inhaling fumes, and I found myself covering my nose and mouth with my shirt as I walked toward the station building. Inside was marginally better, the air conditioning providing some filtration, but the smell still lingered, had apparently soaked into the walls and surfaces, and couldn't be entirely removed by any amount of ventilation. The attendant was an older man, weathered and thin, with eyes that looked tired in a way that went beyond simple physical exhaustion. He took my payment for fuel without much conversation, just nodded when I told him how much I wanted, and I noticed that he was wearing a cloth mask, the kind people wore during the pandemic but that most had abandoned years ago. And I wondered if it was related to the smell, an attempt to filter air that had become nearly unbreathable. "What's burning?" I asked him, trying to sound casual, just a curious traveler rather than someone deeply unsettled by the olfactory assault. "Smells like there's a diesel fire somewhere nearby." He looked at me for a long moment before answering, and I saw something in his expression that might have been pity, or might have been resignation. "Nothing's burning now," he said finally. "That's just how the town smells. Has for years. You get used to it if you're here long enough, though most people don't stay long enough to find out." I wanted to ask more questions, but he'd already turned away, busying himself with paperwork, and I got the sense that the conversation was over, that he'd said everything he was willing to say to a stranger passing through. I went back outside to fuel my truck, breathing through my shirt and trying not to think too hard about what chemicals I might be inhaling with every breath, and I noticed that there were people visible now in some of the other buildings, figures watching from windows or standing in doorways, all of them wearing masks similar to the attendants, all of them still and silent, like they were waiting for something or watching for something specific. The fuel pump worked slowly, the old mechanical system taking its time to deliver diesel to my tank. And while I waited, I walked around the station lot, looking at the town and trying to understand what I was seeing. The buildings were all stained, I realized, darkened in patterns that suggested repeated exposure to smoke or some other airborne contaminant, and the ground was discolored too, the dirt and gravel showing dark patches that might have been oil stains but seemed too extensive and too uniform to be simple spills or leaks. There was a historical marker near the road, one of those state-issued plaques that tell you about significant events or locations, and I walked over to read it while my tank continued filling. The text was brief and oddly vague, stating that this location had been the site of a significant industrial incident in 1991, that several facilities had been damaged and that cleanup efforts had been partially successful before being discontinued due to budget constraints. It didn't specify what kind of industrial facilities or what kind of incident, didn't explain why the cleanup had been abandoned or what remained unresolved. I was studying the marker when the attendant appeared beside me, having left the station to find me. "You should go," he said quietly, still wearing his mask, his voice muffled but urgent. "Finish your fuel and go. Don't stay here any longer than you have to. Don't breathe any more of this air than necessary, and don't come back." "What happened here?" I asked, gesturing at the marker. "What kind of incident?" He looked away, toward the horizon, and I followed his gaze to where I could now see what I'd initially mistaken for a distant mesa was actually a massive structure, some kind of industrial facility or storage complex, dark and seemingly abandoned, but still somehow ominous in its presence. "Diesel fire," he said. "Storage tanks at a distribution facility. Something went wrong, and the whole place went up. Burned for 3 days before they could get it under control. Thousands of gallons of diesel just burning, and the smoke from it settled over the town, soaked into everything." He turned back to me, and I could see his eyes were watering behind the mask. "They said it was safe eventually. Said the air quality was within acceptable limits. But people started getting sick anyway. Respiratory problems and cancers, and things that don't have names, but that kill you slowly. Most people left, the ones who could afford to, the ones who had somewhere else to go. The rest of us stayed because we didn't have a choice, and we breathe this air, and smell this smell, and wait for whatever's going to happen to us." "But that was decades ago," I said, doing the math from the date on the marker. "Shouldn't it have dissipated by now? Shouldn't the smell have faded?" He shook his head. "You'd think so, but it hasn't. If anything, it's gotten worse over the years, gotten stronger and more concentrated. Like the burning never really stopped, like it's still happening somewhere we can't see. Some underground fire or chemical reaction that keeps producing those fumes. We've had inspectors come through, environmental people, and they test the air and find elevated levels of all kinds of things, petroleum products and combustion byproducts, but they can't find the source, can't locate where it's coming from or how to stop it." The fuel pump clicked off behind me, signaling a full tank, and the attendant gestured toward my truck. "You should go now," he repeated, "before you're here long enough for it to get into you, into your lungs and your clothes and your truck. This smell, it stays with you if you're not careful. Follows you even after you leave, and people who stay too long find they can't ever really get away from it, can't ever breathe clean air again without smelling diesel underneath it. I paid him for the fuel and climbed back into my cab, starting the engine and pulling out of the station lot without looking back at the masked figures, still watching from their windows and doorways. I drove for an hour with all the windows open, trying to air out the cab, trying to blow away any trace of that smell that might have infiltrated my truck during the stop. But he was right. The attendant, the smell had gotten into something, because even now, years later, I'll occasionally catch a whiff of burnt diesel when there's no obvious source, when my truck is running clean and there are no other vehicles nearby, and I'll be back in that nameless town in West Texas, breathing contaminated air and watching masked people wait for a sickness that was already inevitable. I've never been able to find that town again, though I've driven that stretch of highway dozens of times since, always watching for the turnoff, or the cluster of buildings, or that distant industrial complex on the horizon. The road just runs straight and empty through the scrubland, no services for 100 miles in either direction, according to the highway signs. And when I check my fuel records from that day, there's no entry for a stop, no receipt or transaction that would prove I'd actually refueled there, rather than making it to the next major town on fumes and luck. But I know I was there. No, I smelled that terrible burning diesel smell and talked to that masked attendant and saw those watching figures. And I know that somewhere in West Texas, there's a town that's still breathing contaminated air from a fire that happened decades ago. Still waiting for help that never came, and that probably never will. Still existing in the shadow of an industrial disaster that everyone else has forgotten or decided wasn't worth cleaning up properly. And the people there, the ones who didn't have the option to leave, they just keep living and breathing and smelling that burnt diesel, day after day. Their bodies slowly accumulating damage from exposure to chemicals that should have dissipated, but somehow haven't, that somehow keep concentrating and intensifying as if the burning were ongoing rather than finished. I think about them sometimes, those masked residents of a nameless town, and I wonder how many of them are still alive, still breathing that toxic air, still waiting for someone to care enough to actually fix the problem, rather than just declaring it acceptable and moving on. And I wonder if the smell really does follow people who stay too long. If some of those residents who did manage to leave, carried it with them, found themselves haunted by phantom diesel fumes that their damaged lungs continued to detect even in clean air, their bodies permanently calibrated to expect contamination and finding it everywhere regardless of reality. The incident marker said, the cleanup was partially successful, which is a bureaucratic way of saying we gave up and left people to deal with the consequences on their own. And I've learned since that there are hundreds of sites like that across the country. Places where industrial accidents or environmental contamination were addressed inadequately and then abandoned. Where people still live and work and breathe air that's slowly killing them because moving wasn't an option and help wasn't coming. That town in West Texas is just one of them. One small cluster of suffering in a landscape full of similar failures. And the fact that I can't find it again, that it seems to have vanished from maps and GPS systems, makes me wonder if it's been deliberately erased, removed from official records, so that no one has to acknowledge it exists, or take responsibility for the people still living there. But they're there. I know they are. Breathing through masks and watching the highway for travelers who might stop and might listen and might care. Enough to do something, though what anyone could do at this point. Decades after the initial disaster and years of inadequate response, I honestly don't know. All I can do is remember them, tell their story to anyone who listen, and hope that somewhere in the machinery of government or industry or public concern, someone will eventually decide that a town full of people breathing toxic air is a problem worth solving, even if that town doesn't appear on any map, and even if those people have already been forgotten by everyone except a truck driver, who stopped there once for fuel and can still smell the burnt diesel whenever he closes his eyes and thinks too hard about the price we make some people pay for the convenience of the rest of us.